Our story begins in a beautiful Chinese temple where countless leaves from an orange-colored tree, one whose name I don't know, begin to fall. At this moment, we see this man here examining a flower for some reason, noticing how beautiful it is. But as he glances to the side, he ends up finding something far more beautiful than that leaf. Just by looking at that girl over there, the guy immediately starts blushing, and the girl notices that he's staring at her, which makes her a bit startled, right? But not because he was some kind of pervert or anything like that. She was actually apologizing to him, explaining that she was just a little tired from carrying water. She also mentioned that it was an honor to meet the warrior leader of the Red Arch, Zhang Haining. Seeing the bucket the girl was carrying, Zhang Hai asked if it wasn't too heavy for her, and before she could even answer, he simply took the bucket from her, telling her that next time, she should carry the water in smaller loads so she wouldn't get as tired. The girl simply apologized and said she understood. As they walked, Zhang Hai commented that it was good she was so enthusiastic and that if she kept up that dedication, it would benefit her someday. The girl then started saying that Zhang Hai was very kind and all that. For those who didn't get it, this was probably some kind of ancient pickup line, or maybe I'm just making stuff up here. A little while later, after they walked a bit more, Zhang Hai, slightly embarrassed, asked for the girl's name. She then introduced herself as the apprentice attendant of Xiong Hall. Now, back in the day, these attendants and apprentices were people who worked near the palace, assisting the king or queen. Oh, and her name was Xiaolan. Just hearing her name was enough to make Zhang Hai tremble. And well, like all Chinese names, hers had a meaning. By pure coincidence, Xiaolan meant an orchid that blooms in winter. Zhang Hai immediately turned to the girl, about to tell her how beautiful she was. But out of nowhere, the sound of a pig interrupted them, instantly drawing their attention. They then saw a wild boar fighting against a guy dressed in white. The guy called the boar Little Demon, and said it had been a long time since he'd met a worthy opponent. Either way, they had to see who would survive that battle. In the next moment, the boar charged at the young man. But instead of backing away, the guy just stood his ground and raised his fists. Somehow he managed to withstand the boar's attack. Then, in the next instant, he counterattacked, but we didn't get to see exactly how, because the fight was so brutal that if we showed it, we'd probably get demonetized. The funny thing is, I thought Zhang Hai or Xiaolan would know who this guy was. But nope, they had no clue either. A while later, after the boar was already dead, the crazy dude in white actually paid his respects to it, saying it was a worthy opponent. As he prepared to move the boar's body, he realized he had some unexpected spectators watching him. That definitely wasn't part of his plan. So, he greeted Zhang Hai, who, by the way, was famous as hell, and apologized for the mess he had made. He admitted he had been a little cruel in his hunting and explained that the boar had actually sneaked into the palace under orders from Elder Baek Xian. Hearing this, Zhang Hai let out a small sigh and questioned if it was true. The young man then mentioned that he should show more respect to Zhang Hai, but he didn't have time for that right now. Actually, he was exhausted and needed to take care of the boar. Zhang Hai, not really interested in talking, just waved him off, telling him to go ahead. The young man also assured them he wouldn't spread any rumors about their private moment together, so things wouldn't get out of hand. And at the mention of a private moment, both Zhang Hai and Xiaolan started blushing. The guy even commented that he knew exactly what was going on and that there was no need for them to hide it anymore. Either way, not wanting to interrupt, he decided to take his leave. And so he left, leaving the two of them both embarrassed and standing in a huge mess. Later on, while carrying the boar somewhere, the young man noticed the autumn season had arrived, judging by the color of the leaves. He also commented that he saw those two earlier and realized they were actually a perfect match. That's because he knew that the warrior leader of the Red Arch, Zhang Hai, would eventually develop feelings for the heroine, Xiaolan. And after they met, Zhang Hai did indeed fall for her. But Xiaolan, with her strong and caring personality, was always surrounded by a crowd of handsome men. Eventually, she rose to the position of celestial maiden, ruling over the palace. And that, in fact, was the plot of the fantasy romance novel Song of the Celestial Dragon. The young man also admitted that, even as a guy, he had to recognize that Zhang Hai was incredibly good-looking. But somehow in the end, he still ended up as the second male lead. I mean, there was no way he could compete with the crown prince, right? So being second place was better than nothing. Oh, and by the way, he had been in this world for 10 years now, the world of a novel he had only partially read in his previous life. In reality, his name was Seol Taepyeong, and he hadn't even existed in the original story. And as you might have already guessed from his name, he had reincarnated as the heroine's younger brother. Before we get into the story, though, we need to explain a little bit about this world. Taepyeong was currently in the great nation that ruled the world, Xiongdu. Within it was a palace called Xiongdongyang, the main setting of the story Song of the Celestial Dragon, filled with romance and a beautiful love story. But honestly, that had nothing to do with Taepyeong. Everyone had their own problems, and he was just making his way past all the couples in front of him while carrying a bloody wild boar in his hands. After tossing the boar into a corner, he muttered that he had been thrown into this world when he was nearly 20, and 10 years had already passed since then. He had been so busy adapting to this new world that he never even had time to think about romance or anything like that. Just then, an old man approached Taepyeong, asking if he was injured since he was covered in blood. Taepyeong Taepyeong quickly explained that it wasn't his blood and stated that he had already dealt with the wild boar that had been wandering around. He then asked the old man to report this to the guards for him. Oh, and as he had said before, don't mention that he was the one who took care of the boar. The old man simply nodded, and with that, Taepyeong thanked the elder before dragging the boar inside. The old man then reminded Taepyeong to take a bath after handling the boar. Currently, Taepyeong was in a section of the palace known as Baekseonggung, which, roughly translated, meant Palace of the White Sage. This was where the Taoists responsible for spiritual matters within the palace resided. These Taoists were called Baekseong, which literally meant a white sage. And in the middle of all this, Taepyeong was a martial officer assisting the elder Baekseong, probably the old man from earlier. After cutting up the boar a little, Taepyeong remarked that it was an incredibly satisfying feeling to receive such a great reward after a tough job. At that moment, someone approached Taepyeong from behind. Feeling his hands tremble slightly, he turned around, wondering if he was really the only one assigned to kitchen duty that day. But when he saw who it was, he immediately relaxed. It was his sister. Seolm quickly voiced her concern for him, asking if he was okay, how his injuries were, and even mentioning that she had gotten some ointment from the head maid. Taepyeong assured her that he was fine but questioned whether it was really safe for a concubine to be wandering around Baekseonggung. Wait, so she was already married? He didn't even know that. Oh right, it must be to the prince. Now it made sense. Regardless, Seolm explained that since her younger brother was injured, of course, she would come running. Even so, Taepyeong warned her to be careful, reminding her of how strict palace rules were. Seolm, however, simply stated that she had told people she was running a small errand. Hearing this, Taepyeong thought that if she was supposed to be the female lead in a romantic fantasy, she needed at least this level of boldness. To better understand how Taepyeong had ended up here, we needed to go back a little in time. First off, the clan Taepyeong and Seolm came from was called Wayong Seol. Man, what a name. Seriously, these names were something else. Whoever came up with them was really out to break people's brains. Anyway, their clan didn't last very long. Honestly, with a name like that, he wasn't surprised. The reason? Suspected treason. At the time, Seolm was only 7 years old when she witnessed the execution of her entire clan right before her eyes. She barely managed to escape, clutching only her small hand. For a while, she and Taepyeong had to beg on the streets of Wangdo just to survive. That continued for several years until they were eventually captured by palace guards. However, since they were illegitimate children, they narrowly escaped execution thanks to the mercy of Wayong, the celestial maiden. But that didn't mean they got off scot-free. Instead of being executed, they were condemned to serve in the palace for the rest of their lives, Taepyeong as a warrior in training and Seolm as an attendant. A normal person would probably feel miserable about being in such a situation, right? But somehow, Seolm remained calm and determined. Just then, she finished preparing the ointment for Taepyeong and reminded him to apply it every single day until his wounds fully healed. If anything happened, he should let her know. Taepyeong nodded, and then Seolm asked if there was anything going on in his life. She meant romantically, was he seeing anyone? But Taepyeong immediately shut that down, saying he wasn't interested in that sort of thing. That answer was extremely disappointing to Seolm, who sighed and declared that her brother had the soul of an old man. But since they were on the topic, Taepyeong wasn't about to let it slide. He pointed out that she should be the one worrying about romance, especially since the guy she was talking to earlier was none other than the leader of the Red Bao warriors. Seolm quickly denied having anything going on with Zhang Yihai. But internally, Taepyeong knew that while she was saying that now, it wouldn't be long before the crown prince fell for her as well. Since she was already there, Taepyeong asked if she wanted to eat something. Seolm admitted she would like to, but since she had only come up with an excuse to check on him, she needed to get back quickly. Oh, and she also mentioned that Zhang Yihai wanted to meet Taepyeong, and that he was supposed to go to the Red Bao at sunrise tomorrow. Taepyeong naturally asked why, and Seolm replied that she wasn't entirely sure. But from what she had seen, it seemed Zhang Yihai was curious about him. Hearing this, Taepyeong felt a bit disappointed. He had ended up attracting attention without meaning to. Since Seolm had already passed on the message, she was about to leave. Meanwhile, Taepyeong was left thinking, of all people, why did the warrior leader Zhang Yihai have to call for him? The last thing he wanted was to get into trouble without meaning to. But overthinking things wouldn't help, and overthinking made him hungry. So, he decided to drop those thoughts and just focus on his soup. The next day, Zhang Yihai asked Taepyeong why he looked so startled. He then got straight to the point, asking if Taepyeong was interested in joining the Red Bao. If he wanted to, Zhang Yihai would arrange a spot for him. Taepyeong, however, was completely caught off guard. Things were moving way too fast. To understand how he got into this situation, we need to rewind a few hours. Earlier, Taepyeong had arrived at the Red Bao headquarters, introducing himself as Taepyeong, a trainee warrior from Baekseonggung. He announced that he had come because he heard the warrior leader, Zhang Yihai, was looking for him. The poor guard on duty covered his ears since Taepyeong was practically shouting. He told Taepyeong to wait while he went to confirm. Meanwhile, Taepyeong reflected that he had been deliberately loud to show his powerful spirit through his voice, a way of displaying respect. After all, he needed to be polite wherever he went. Soon, the guard returned, telling him he was allowed to enter. As he walked in, Taepyeong Taepyeong silently hoped this wasn't about anything serious. Upon arriving, Zhang Yihai got straight to the point. He mentioned how Taepyeong had taken down that massive boar without sustaining any serious injuries. That alone showed he had impressive strength. Zhang Yihai then asked if Taepyeong trained regularly. Taepyeong replied that even though he was just a trainee, if he was going to call himself a palace warrior, of course, he had to train every day. Zhang Yihai chuckled, saying that sounded like something straight out of a textbook. But the Red Bao valued substance over appearances, so he wanted to hear the truth from Taepyeong. Taepyeong insisted he was being honest. His strength was something he had acquired over time. Zhang Yihai asked if that meant he wasn't born with it. Taepyeong confirmed, explaining that when he was about 7 years old, he nearly died from the divine fever. But after surviving it, he became much stronger. Now, the divine fever was a process of absorbing divine energy. If a person survived it, they would gain extraordinary abilities. However, it was also the most painful of the 3 trials of calamities, known as the Sanji Suryun. Those who suffered from the divine fever endured excruciating pain alone. But, as mentioned before, if they survived, they gained power beyond what an ordinary human could imagine. There was even a rumor that surviving the divine fever meant being chosen by the celestial emperor. Hearing this, Zhang Yihai remarked that it was a waste for someone like Taepyeong to be stuck in an idle position at Baekseongung. With his strength, he could join the Red Bao and reach far greater heights. After all, to be a truly renowned warrior, one needed wisdom, virtue, and physical strength. And since Taepyeong only had strength, that alone wasn't enough to take him further. At this, Taepyeong admitted that he was at least aware of his own limits. Internally, though, he was just saying whatever would get him out of there as quickly as possible without causing trouble. But Zhang Yihai noted that this self-awareness was a rare quality in a warrior. That was why, if Taepyeong wanted, he would open a spot for him in the Red Bao. And that brings us back to the present moment, where Zhang Yihai was asking why Taepyeong looked so scared. Taepyeong wasn't sure how to respond, so after a brief pause, he politely thanked Zhang Yihai for the offer. However, he explained that he was from the Wayong Seol clan and was only there thanks to the mercy of the Celestial Maiden. Because of that, he couldn't join the Red Bao. Zhang Yihai immediately told him to shut up, commenting that he was really good at making excuses. Besides, he had already said that the Red Bao valued action over appearances. So, if Taepyeong had a reason he didn't want to share, he could just say so without worrying. Taepyeong hesitated before admitting that, honestly, his reason wasn't all that noble. His motto was simply to take whatever job paid him the most. At this, there was a brief silence before Zhang Yihai burst into laughter, finally declaring that he understood exactly what kind of person Taepyeong was. Honestly, that was to be expected. Just because Taepyeong was a palace warrior didn't mean he couldn't be a little shrewd. So, Zhang Yihai agreed, Taepyeong definitely wasn't a good fit for the Red Bao. Since Taepyeong was holding a sword, Zhang Yihai wanted to see how well he could handle it. Taepyeong, however, quickly clarified that the sword was just part of his uniform. He didn't actually know how to use it. But seeing the way Taepyeong held the sword, Zhang Yihai immediately called him out on his lie. In response, Taepyeong simply revealed his katana. Zhang Yihai, examining the blade, noticed it was in excellent condition. And from what he remembered, a warrior's weapon reflected their skill. That meant Taepyeong at least knew how to wield it. Changing the subject, Zhang Yihai brought up the maid they had seen earlier, and Taepyeong quickly understood where this conversation was going. But Zhang Yihai insisted that their encounter had been nothing more than a coincidence. Taepyeong agreed, albeit a coincidence that could change someone's fate. This led to a back and forth, one denying, the other insisting it was a lie, and so on. Later that night, as Zhang Yihai gazed at the starry sky, he reflected on how, for just a brief moment, the way Taepyeong gripped his sword was completely different from a typical martial artist. It was a trait seen in those who had spent years wielding heavy black iron swords. Not only that, but Taepyeong had used a novice's grip to try and conceal his true skill. However, his eyes gave him away. Realizing this, Zhang Yihai muttered to himself that Naigon had hidden something within the palace. Meanwhile, on Taepyeong's side, a new girl appeared. She asked if he had caught a wild boar, because if so, they were supposed to make a Ehuigu Gurue Yururu, or something like that. Her name was Yanghe, but it seemed like it was too late for that, since they had already cooked and eaten the boar. This, of course, made Yanghe furious because she had arrived too late. Taepyeong dismissed the whole Ehuigu Gurue Yururu thing and told her to just enjoy the hot pork soup while it was still warm. But Yanghe was still annoyed, grumbling about how they turned everything they caught into soup. She then asked Elder Naigon to say something to Taepyeong. Naigon, who was the white sage mentioned earlier, was apparently also known as Li Xiulun's. Where Naigon had come from was anyone's guess. Instead of taking Yanghe's side, though, the old man just told Taepyeong that he had added too much salt this time. Frustrated, Yanghe gave up on arguing. Then, Naigon told Taepyeong to check on the defensive formation near the concubine's quarters, and if he didn't want to go alone, he could take Yanghe with him. Taepyeong, who had no interest in extra work, argued that if it was a formation issue, it would be better for Naigon himself to handle it. But Naigon simply stated that he had something else to take care of and couldn't go. Given Lady Sukbai's condition, Taepyeong would be more useful. Taepyeong wanted to know why, but Naigon only told him that he would understand when he arrived at Cheongdonggang. At this point, Taepyeong was internally screaming at all these ridiculous ridiculously long names. At Shongdonggong, or at least that's what he was trying to call it, the concubines were trembling in fear. A hoarse, eerie voice was whispering, begging them to kill her as she approached the concubine's residence. Yang He commented that if that maid, Xiaolan, was in the concubine's quarters, she would probably be happy. But Taepyeong, skeptical, replied that he wasn't so sure about that. Yang He then mentioned that Lady Sukbai's illness seemed to be connected to the protection formation. Hearing this, Taepyeong felt uneasy. If it really was an issue with the formation worsening Lady Sukbai's condition, then Naigon, the expert, should have come himself. Why would he send a mere trainee instead? After inspecting the formation, Taepyeong concluded that it was perfectly fine, meaning Lady Sukbai's illness had nothing to do with it. To check, he used a special board that was linked to talismans in the concubines' rooms. Because if he had to inspect each concubine's room one by one, he was doomed. One of the maids, upon hearing Taepyeong's assessment, commented that since he was from Baekseongung, a place known for dealing with spirits, his words must be true. Taepyeong then asked how sick Lady Sukbai really was. The maid responded that she coughed every night. Since she was just a low-ranking servant, she only heard things indirectly, but she had recently overheard the other maids in Shongdonggong saying that Lady Sukbai's face was growing darker with each passing day. Hearing this, Taepyeong decided to check on Lady Sukbai before leaving. Upon arriving at Shongdonggong, Taepyeong introduced himself, stating that he had been sent by Elder Naigon to assess Lady Sukbai's condition. And thus, he was greeted by Shongdonggong's head maid. God, that name was so long. From now on, he'd just call it Shongdonggong. Oh, and the maid's name was Hyun. She had already been informed about Taepyeong. As they made their way to Sukbai's chamber, Taepyeong asked what the doctor had said. Hyun simply stated that Taepyeong would understand the situation once he saw it for himself. Internally, Taepyeong reflected that it had been some time since the doctor had last visited. That was strange, especially considering that, from what he had just heard, Sukbai's condition worsened every night. As they approached her quarters, the other concubines were already whispering about Taepyeong, commenting that he was there to see Lady Sukbai and, since he carried a sword, he must be a warrior. But as he walked, Taepyeong noticed something was very wrong. The closer he got to the central chambers where Lady Sukbai was resting, the more eerily silent and unsettling the atmosphere became. This was odd. There should have been servants constantly tending to her. When they arrived, Hyun instructed Taepyeong to open the inner door. Lady Sukbai was likely lying in bed. Seeing that Hyun stopped at the doorway, Taepyeong asked if she wasn't coming in with him. Yeonhee then told Taepyeong that he was the one who had to go in first. But just as they were about to open the door, a young girl suddenly appeared, declaring that they couldn't enter. She introduced herself as an apprentice of Shongdong and insisted that their presence could be considered rude. However, she pleaded with them both to leave immediately. Suddenly, two other girls pulled the young apprentice aside, chastising her for making things difficult for the warrior. After all, he was only there to assess the situation. The girl then started saying something about Taepyeong's sword, warning him not to use it and begging him to show mercy to Lady Sukbai. Hearing this, Taepyeong turned to Yeonhee and said he had a bad feeling about this, suggesting she should go back. Of course, Yeonhee refused. If she returned now, Elder Nahegan would absolutely chew her out. But the moment they opened the door, a nauseating stench hit their noses. The room was utterly filthy, and Lady Sukbai was just as unkempt. Taepyeong immediately recognized that something was seriously wrong. There were plenty of servants in Shongdong, so how had they let someone end up in such a state? Then, as Sukbai gazed at Taepyeong, eerie voices, accompanied by disembodied hands, began whispering, crying out in agony. They spoke of unbearable pain, of having no strength left, and begged to be put out of their misery, pleading for death to end their suffering. In an instant, Taepyeong realized this was a forbidden technique, one that manipulated a person's mind. For a brief moment, the voices grew even stronger, urging him to kill her. Before he could do anything reckless, he bit his lip, a technique, in quotes, that Elder Nahegan himself had once taught him. Looking down at his hands, Taepyeong was startled to realize they had instinctively reached for his sword. Then, as he questioned what was happening to Lady Sukbai, Taepyeong recognized the symptoms. This was divine fever. That's why the elder had sent him instead of coming himself. Just then, Yeonhee suddenly grabbed Taepyeong's sword, exclaiming that she had finally found a blade. Taepyeong had to stop her immediately or they'd be in serious trouble. But Yeonhee had entered a trance, repeating that they needed to kill Sukbai, that it was the best course of action. Realizing there was no reasoning with her, Taepyeong acted quickly. A while later, outside the chamber, Taepyeong had managed to get Yeonhee away from the scene. The poor girl was hunched over, vomiting profusely and groaning about how she had almost killed Lady Sukbai. Taepyeong assured her that he understood how she felt. Yeonhee thanked him, adding that it felt like her life had flashed before her eyes. She had also experienced terrible nightmares. Taepyeong asked what kind of nightmares. Yeonhee responded that she dreamed of a soup filled with an absurd amount of boiled thistle stems. In short, she had a nightmare about soup. Hearing this, Taepyeong realized that Yeonhee had returned to normal. But when he turned his attention to the servants, they were trembling with fear. Taepyeong then questioned Wainin, asking why she hadn't confiscated his sword before he entered. Was she, by any chance, trying to use them to kill Lady Sukbai? At that moment, a flashback struck Taepyeong. Selon's voice echoed in his mind, telling him that he had to survive no matter what. Even if the odds were 1 in 100,000, he must never give up. Even if fighting against it seemed pointless, he must never ever surrender his life. Because if he endured, he would survive. And he must not doubt that. Back in the present, Yunhee was demanding to know what Taepyeong meant. How could the servants have done something like this? But Waynon simply admitted that she had committed an unforgivable sin. Hearing this, even the other servants, or maybe they were concubines, fell into an uneasy silence. Then Henri questioned how they had the courage to do such a thing, and Howen stated that they believed it was the right thing to do. Ever since Lady Sukbai had assumed her position, there hadn't been a single day when they didn't care for her. Moreover, they were proud to serve Seongdong and had devoted themselves entirely to her. However, when they discovered that Lady Sukbai had contracted the divine fever, they panicked and did everything they could to save her. Yet, her condition only worsened over 2 seasons, until she eventually began begging them to end her suffering. And 5 days ago, she even started using that spell to force them to kill her. Henri declared that if that was the case, they should have handled the situation themselves. Why the hell were they trying to involve Baek Seongdong, the place of the White Sages? Howen replied that the two of them were known as Elder Naegang's favorites. If they carried out the act, the elder himself would vouch for them, claiming that they had no choice but to succumb to Lady Sukbai's spell. Yunhee, already exhausted from the situation, told Taepyeong that they needed to report this to the palace immediately. If things continued this way, the problem would only grow worse. After thinking for a moment, Taepyeong simply declared that he forgave Howen. This completely baffled Yunhee, given what Howen had just admitted. Taepyeong explained what he had realized. In reality, the servants didn't need their help to kill Lady Sukbai. All they had to do was report the divine fever to the palace officials. And yet, despite everything, they chose not to. Instead, they continued pretending it was just a common illness, hiding the truth about the divine fever. This made sense, considering what Taepyeong remembered. The palace officials only cared about the crown prince. Lady Sukbai had even entered the palace as the crown princess. But since she had contracted the divine fever and had only recently assumed her position, this was considered an unacceptable flaw for a princess. That meant that before the crown prince made a formal commitment, they would simply replace her with a new Sukbai. After all, when someone contracted the divine fever, it was practically a death sentence. Someone like Howen would have realized that a mile away. That's why she kept Lady Sukbai's illness a secret. But a disease like the divine fever didn't only destroy the patient, it was slowly killing Seongdong itself. Taepyeong understood what she had been going through, knowing how much she had endured and considered before taking action. That's why he wouldn't report the truth to the palace. Even so, Howen admitted that she had tried to turn Taepyeong into an assassin. Taepyeong agreed and told her that she would still have to pay for it. But there was something he wanted to ask her. However, given the urgency of the situation, he decided to save it for later. Instead, he asked Howen to help them save Lady Sukbai. Speaking of her, she was in immense pain in her chamber. The moment she saw Taepyeong's sword lying on the floor, she tried to crawl toward it. But in the process, she caught sight of her own reflection in the mirror. She had once believed she was meant to become the most beautiful flower of Seongdong, to live a life of splendor and radiance. Instead, she had turned into nothing more than a filthy sewer rat reeking of sickness. Rather than fighting against it, she would rather die. Just as she prepared to act, Taepyeong appeared. For a moment, the two of them stared at each other in silence. Taepyeong, alarmed, swiftly reached for his knife before she could do anything reckless. Looking at him, Sukbai said this was good. She needed someone to drive the blade into her chest. She then used that spell again, trying to force Taepyeong to kill her. When Taepyeong drew his knife, Sukbai accepted her fate. But instead, he stabbed his own leg. He then declared that he needed determination, courage, passion, and strength. After all, he was a real man. He then launched into a speech filled with strange Chinese proverbs, but the message was clear: she shouldn't give up. With enough determination, courage, and passion, there was nothing in this world they couldn't overcome. Tearing a piece of his sleeve, Taepyeong revealed a strange mark on his arm, proof that he had survived the divine fever himself. He understood exactly how painful it was. Even if the odds were 1 in 100,000, she must never stop fighting to survive. Even if it seemed foolish and meaningless, giving up on life was never an option. That's why she had to live, because she was the lady of Seongdong, and one day she would lead that palace as the master of Taoist arts. Sukbai, stunned, questioned how Taepyeong could possibly know that, and Taepyeong answered that it was because he believed in the truth. But Sukbai had heard those same words countless times before, to the point where they no longer held any meaning for her. Yet, for some reason, hearing them from Taepyeong made them sound different. For the first time, she felt like she could actually survive. Meanwhile, Hyun was desperate, realizing she needed advice from someone who had taken care of a patient with the divine fever. And there was only one person in the entire palace with that experience. Well, everyone already knew who it was. It was none other than Taepyeong's sister. A while later, Taepyeong himself went to see his sister. She told him that she had fed the patient the refining elixir and revitalizing medicine. Instead of water, she had used immortal spring water, and that had been the only remedy that showed any effect. It seemed like the speech bubbles got mixed up here, because the dialogue was placed over Solon, but apparently, it was Taepyeong speaking. Solon then asked if Lady Sukbai was suffering from a fever. Internally, Taepyeong trusted his sister, so he decided he could share this secret. He answered that she probably was. He then added decided that, judging by the advanced level of the confusion arts being used, her trial should have already ended. It was obvious that she was going to make it. The problem was that the confusion arts she was using had spiraled out of control. Solon pointed out that Taepyeong had also endured the same burden as her. Either way, helping Sukbai wouldn't be easy. Then, out of nowhere, Solon grabbed Taepyeong's arm and noticed that he was covered in cuts. She was immediately shocked because, according to what Taepyeong had said, he was never in any danger. And yet, here he was looking like that. Taepyeong reassured her that she didn't need to worry. He claimed that a bowl of hot soup, some medicine from Elder Meng, and a good night's sleep would be enough to fix everything. However, Solon countered that while physical wounds could heal, the confusion arts had also damaged his spirit. Still, Taepyeong insisted that the palace maids of Shandong were already at their limit. There wasn't much more he could do. Despite that, Solon remained concerned about Taepyeong. Sometime later, on the maid's side, they were all thinking the same thing. Lady Sukbai had to survive. Even if the odds were slim, she should never stop fighting. They started repeating to themselves what they had once told Taepyeong when he was sick. Giving up was not an option, and life was more important than anything else. That was why she couldn't abandon the fight yet, and she should never doubt that fact. One day, Taepyeong asked Sukbai if she liked soup, like a steaming bowl of spicy broth while sipping tea on the side. To Taepyeong, that was the essence of life, but to Yunhee it was a nightmare, and poor Sukbai was barely holding on, with Taepyeong rambling about something like that. She even asked why he was going so far for her. Internally, Taepyeong reflected, did people really need a reason to help someone who was suffering? Calculating the benefits beforehand. That was something only small-minded people did, and for that reason, Taepyeong declared that this was what a real man would do. Sukbai found Taepyeong's answer, well, kind of weird, so much so that she straight up told him he was actually just an idiot. That night, as Taepyeong was leaving, a guard noticed he was bleeding like crazy and asked what the hell had happened inside, and Taepyeong just casually replied that he fell. Come on, Taepyeong, you could have come up with a better excuse. Seriously, he'd fell and ended up in that state? Well, the truth was, he did all that because they had to keep Sukbai's fever a secret. And since Taepyeong had already done everything he could, the only thing left was to inform Elder Meng. But at that moment, Taepyeong suddenly started staggering. He had to sit down on a rock to keep himself steady. That's when Solon appeared. She told him that she had warned him this would happen. Then, without hesitation, she started examining his wounds, declaring that he had clearly pushed himself way past his limits. Taepyeong tried to tell her not to keep sneaking out of the concubine's quarters. It would only cause more trouble. But Solon just replied that if he didn't want her to do that, then he should stop making her worry. However, even she knew that Taepyeong would never ignore Sukbai's suffering. Honestly, if Taepyeong had just dropped off the medicine and left, that would have been fine. But no, he had to stay, getting himself hurt in the process while trying to stop Sukbai from harming herself. Taepyeong simply replied that those who seemed the most desperate to die were the ones who needed a reason to live the most. And then, he asked his sister if she remembered when he had suffered from the divine fever. Every night, she had sat by his side while he writhed in pain. And every time, she would always tell a story. Sometimes, she talked about distant lands he had never heard of. Other times, she described how beautiful the roadside flowers were. And a whole lot of other random conversations that didn't really make sense. But the simple fact that she had so much to talk about made Taepyeong very happy. There were even some stories so bizarre that they were impossible to understand. Apparently, though, they were quite embarrassing because Solon was visibly flustered. But what Taepyeong was trying to say was that, even if it didn't make much sense to Solon, he knew from experience. Sometimes, it doesn't take much for someone to feel like they could stay a little longer. Seeing a small flower bloom, tasting a delicious meal, or looking at a sky so stunning it takes your breath away. It might seem silly at first glance, right? But somehow, for someone who feels lost, those little things can mean everything. And well, the next day, as the birds sang, announcing the start of a new day, Tsukibi finally woke up. And since she couldn't stay lying down forever, she tried to get up. Her body, however, wasn't strong enough and she collapsed. But after gathering a little more strength, she managed to run out of her room. This startled the maids waiting outside. A while later, Ruin arrived, calling for Miss Tsukibi. And the first thing Tsukibi said upon standing up was that she was starving. Tears welled up in Ruin's eyes as she hugged her, declaring that if there was anything Tsukibi wanted to eat, she would do her best to prepare it. At that moment, Tsukibi made her request. She wanted soup. Meanwhile, elsewhere, we are introduced to a new head maid, Hyundang. She was the chief maid of the Jujak Palace and was reporting that Lady Tsukibi had recovered from her illness. The noblewoman she was speaking to commented that this was wonderful news. Oh, and she wasn't just anyone, she was a noble consort named In Hairong. She remarked that it would be appropriate to send Tsukibi a gift since overcoming a long illness was certainly a cause for celebration. Hyundang continued, saying that soon, the selection process for Lady Deokbi would be completed. She stated with confidence that someone truly deserving of the title of Deokbi would be chosen, someone with many qualities and the potential to learn. She then asked if they should also prepare a background gift for the selected candidate before she officially entered the harem. The noble consort agreed, but said they should prioritize the gift for Lady Tsukibi first. She then asked what would be a good choice. Hyundang suggested a finely embroidered handkerchief handkerchief featuring a pine tree, a symbol of good health. The noble consort approved. However, Hyundang had one more thing to report. Apparently, a warrior had played a crucial role in Lady Tsukibi's recovery. According to what she had heard, without his help, Tsukibi's condition might not have improved. But there was a problem. This warrior was an apprentice of Baexian Palace, and he was originally from the Wei Jiang Sol family. Upon hearing this, Ha-yun asked if that wasn't the rebel clan responsible for killing her uncle. Meanwhile, back to Taepyeong, he was saying that he never intended to kill her. He admitted that, yes, he might have gone a little too far, but it wasn't that serious. He was talking to Yunhee and the topic? The salty soup he had made. Taepyeong insisted that despite using high-quality ingredients, she still wanted to appreciate the natural flavor. But Yunhee wasn't buying it. She declared that, regardless of how high quality it was, in the end, it was just rice soaked in water and salt. How could he even call that a broth? Taepyeong, however, defended himself, saying that she was only reacting like that because she had started crying. It was as if he had destroyed her entire world. And besides, that salt was no ordinary salt. It was called celestial fire salt, refined for 7 years in the Chunggang region of Donghe. But at the end of the day, it was still just salt. As they ate, Taepyeong commented that it had been a while since they last saw Elder Meng. The old man in the group responded that he had probably gone wandering in the mountains. Ever since Taepyeong had visited Cheongdu Palace, he had been busy meeting with palace officials. Yunhee added that every time she entered his room, it was always spotless, clear evidence that he had no intention of returning anytime soon. And at that moment, as they were having dinner, a voice suddenly spoke up. It declared that it was time to find an opportunity to apologize and express gratitude, and that voice belonged to none other than Hong. The old man remarked that Hong shouldn't bow since she was the chief maid of Cheongdu Palace, while they were just warrior apprentices. If the palace officials saw this, they would be shocked. But Hong replied that this was precisely why she had come here, away from any prying eyes. Yunhee, witnessing the moment, commented that if things had gone wrong, an apology like that wouldn't have been enough. And Hong continued, saying that as a token of gratitude, she had brought some ingredients. Since she had heard that Yunhee was interested in cooking, she gathered a variety of seasonings for her to experiment with in different recipes. Oh, and most of them needed to be stored properly, so she had to find a suitable place for them. Upon hearing this, Yunhee's attitude changed completely, and she asked Hong if she could, by any chance, call her sister, declaring that she was kind and generous. To honor her boundless kindness, Yunhee prepared meat pancakes for dinner. Hong mentioned that the ingredients were personal gifts from the maids of the Mesticus, and that Lady Sukbai had also sent an official token of appreciation to Taepyeong. It wasn't anything extravagant, just a small jewelry box and a thank you letter. Taepyeong responded that if that was all, he would gladly accept it. At that moment, he noticed that behind Hong stood his sister. That night, Seolon commented that she was very relieved that Sukbai had recovered. Taepyeong asked how her duties in the harem were going. Seolon replied that, after some time, she had gotten used to them and was now quite comfortable. In reality, she was more worried about Taepyeong, who was always getting hurt. Taepyeong reassured her, saying that his body healed quickly, so she didn't need to worry. But shifting topics, he wanted to know if there had been any progress between her and Jang Hai. Seolon, caught off guard, questioned what on earth he was talking about. Taepyeong took that as confirmation that things were going well between them, which made Seolon tell him to cut it out. She then said that he should be the one looking for a partner, and if he didn't, she would find one for him herself. But putting that aside, it was time to open the little jewelry box that Lady Sukbai had gifted him. When they opened it, they didn't really understand what they were looking at. Seolon asked if it was normal for a young lady to give such a gift. Taepyeong admitted that he had no idea. The hairpin inside was quite beautiful, so Taepyeong asked if Seolon wanted to keep it. She responded that she couldn't possibly do that since it was a gift of gratitude meant for him, but she said this while already holding it in her hands. Among the gifts, there was also a letter. But as soon as Taepyeong looked at it, he could already see a problem. It was a light pink scroll with hand-embroidered details tied with a beautiful red silk ribbon. Both Seolon and Taepyeong started sweating nervously. It was a poem, a very beautiful one, actually. Essentially, it was a love confession from Sukbai, saying that she couldn't get Taepyeong out of her mind and all that romantic stuff. At first, Taepyeong thought, no way, this can't be from Sukbai. But no, her name was right there at the end of the letter. After a brief silence, Seolon panicked. She had told Taepyeong to find a partner inside the palace, but if he got involved with the crown princess, that was an instant death sentence. But it didn't make sense coming from Sukbai either. Why had she done this? In a desperate attempt to erase any evidence, Seolon immediately threw the letter into the fire. Meanwhile, on Sukbai's side, yeah, she was deeply in love with Taepyeong. So much so that she was talking to herself, wondering if she could visit Baekseongdong and see Taepyeong's face one more time. At that moment, Taepyeong had no idea that his harsh reality, or rather, his struggle to survive, was only just beginning. The next day, Yang-ri was visibly shaken as she questioned Taepyeong, asking if he thought Lady Sukbai had feelings for him. Because just look at all the gifts, he didn't even know what to say. Yang-ri remarked that, sure, Taepyeong was kind of cute and all, but his mannerisms made him seem like a man in his 50s. So how on earth had Lady Sukbai fallen for him? Seolon, trying to defend her brother's image, age, pointed out that he didn't always act like an old man. Well, actually, most of the time he did. Taepyeong, confused, asked whether she was defending him or accusing him. Seo-lon went on to say that she knew a girl Sukbai's age could fall in love, but she would usually lose interest quickly if given enough time. However, 2 months had passed and Sukbai was still sending gifts. Even those potatoes over there. Taepyeong pointed out that they had been waiting for a long time. The first time she sent a gift was during autumn. Now it was already winter, and the crown prince's birthday celebration was just around the corner. They couldn't just sit around doing nothing. Seo-lon asked what they were going to do. Taepyeong simply said that now wasn't the time to overthink things, he needed confidence. But then someone shouted at him, telling him he absolutely couldn't do that. So that left only one option, talking to Sukbai. But obviously, in private, otherwise, things could go very wrong. Seo-lon asked what he planned to say to her. Taepyeong responded that instead of overthinking it, he would just approach her with confidence and boldly declare, someone who is supposed to be the crown princess shouldn't have feelings for a mere warrior apprentice. And that was that. Youngri commented that this was exactly the kind of thing Taepyeong would say. However, this was just a preliminary plan. Taepyeong was confused. What did she mean by preliminary? Youngri explained that it would be nice if that was enough, but it would probably just make things worse. Again, Taepyeong asked what she meant. Youngri pointed out that only a young girl could truly understand her own heart. But to help Taepyeong understand better, she put it in simpler terms. Girls often find forbidden love exciting. They start seeing themselves as the tragic heroine in a romance story, and that only makes their feelings grow stronger. Taepyeong turned to Sao and asked if that was true. After thinking for a moment, she answered yes. The alluring idea of rebellion and forbidden love was definitely something. So Youngri's words shouldn't be taken too lightly. Given that, distancing himself from Sukbai was the worst possible approach. The best way to handle it was to make Sukbai lose interest in him. For instance, they could ask Ruin to say bad things about Taepyeong. Since she was close to Sukbai, that would probably be more effective. And so they went ahead with the plan. But it didn't work. Apparently, Sukbai had raised Ruin to be too honest. When she tried to lie, she couldn't hold it in. She had to admit the truth. She was completely shocked by what she had heard. In the end, she apologized to Taepyeong. Taepyeong was in total despair. This was literally a life or death situation for him, and Ruin had just confessed everything. Ruin simply stated that she couldn't go against Sukbai's will, and besides, Taepyeong was asking her to speak badly about the person who had saved her life. Looking at it that way, it was kind of strange to expect her to do that. Taepyeong agreed it made sense. The real issue was their social positions. If they took things too far, they could end up violating royal protocol. In short, this could turn into a complete disaster. At that moment, Ruin told Taepyeong that they owed him a great debt, so she would do everything she could to cooperate. However, he should understand that it's difficult to go against the will of Tsukibi's law. Taepyeong got the message right, because, like, Ruin is caught in the middle of all this, and she's the one under the most pressure from both sides. Ruin went on to say that she might not be able to help much because she was busy with preparations for the birthday celebration. Taepyeong acknowledged that he understood, and besides, it's not like he was going to lose his head the next morning. That's why they needed to be careful. But at that moment, something clicked in Taepyeong's mind. He finally came up with a plan. And out of nowhere, he just started losing it, laughing like a maniac. Meanwhile, over at the Red Bao training grounds, Zhang Yihai suddenly declared that he was surrendering. His opponent then asked if he had been holding back. Zhang Yihai stated that he couldn't do that, especially since the person he was up against was none other than Ha Yayan. So he told the truth. He wielded his sword carefully to make sure he didn't hurt her, right? Ha Yayan acknowledged this, saying she understood, as it was a reflection of his loyalty. But internally, Zhang Yihai started reflecting. He had trained his entire life, focusing solely on martial arts, whereas the young lady had to master beauty, virtue, poetry, composition, and martial arts. And yet, her swordsmanship was incredibly refined. She had probably honed her technique to compensate for the lack of physical strength compared to men. Ha Yayan then mentioned that she had heard a lot about the future of the Red Bao. Even the Majesty himself had praised it. And indeed, the rumors were true. It was thanks to warriors like Zhang Yihai that King Du could conquer the world. Zhang Yihai responded that she was giving him too much credit. Ha Yayan then admitted that she would have liked to ask him for more guidance in swordsmanship. However, she was there that day to find a worthy warrior. Zhang Yihai immediately understood. Ha Yayan explained that she wanted to present a sparring match during the birthday celebration, but she didn't have a partner for it. Since she would be busy with the event preparations, she asked Zhang Yihai if he had any suitable candidates in mind. After some thought, Zhang Yihai said he wasn't entirely sure of the warrior's true level, but he showed great promise. Ha Yayan commented that if Zhang Yihai himself was praising him, then he must be skilled. But when Zhang Yihai revealed that the warrior was a young trainee named Chao Taepyeong from Baeksangung, Ha Yayan's expression changed instantly. She immediately recognized the name and asked if he was the one from the Huaigianko clan. Zhang Yihai instantly apologized. Ha Yayan, however, reassured him that it was fine. After all, it was an understandable mistake for someone like Zhang Yihai, who was focused solely on training rather than politics. That said, she wanted to know more about this Chao Taepyeong. Carrying the blood of the Huaisang Chao clan was no small thing. If the rumors were true, he had a history mystery that made him despised by Ha Yayan, who, according to many, was a celestial fairy descended from the heavens. Knowing that she would never forgive Taepyeong, he actually felt happy about it. Can you believe that? Because, like, she hated him, right? And since she was on equal footing in authority with Su Chi-bai, she could go against Tsukibi's law. However, it was obvious that Ha Yayan wouldn't openly oppose the crown princess right away. Taepyeong needed to create a reason for that, but he already had a plan. On Prince Yuan's birthday, a sudden demonic attack would cause chaos in the palace. At that moment, Xiaolon would step in to save the prince. That would set things in motion between them, and most likely, Ha Yayan would be affected by it. If Taepyeong managed to make himself look like a total failure, Ha Yayan's opinion of him would sink even lower. And that was basically his genius plan. While he was thinking all this, Yayan came running, calling out his name and saying that things were looking bad. Su Chi-bai was there waiting for him. Obviously, Taepyeong asked why. According to Yayan, it seemed that Su Chi-bai had come to seek guidance from Elder Meng, which made sense, given that the birthday celebration was approaching. Since she would need to display her talents, she was likely seeking guidance to prepare for it. And it wasn't just because of the celebration. After all, even Ha Yayan had sought instructions from Zhang Hai. Moreover, Su Chi-bai was skilled in Taoist techniques. And speaking of Elder Meng, he was the best in that field, so it made sense for her to go to him. However, there was a problem. Once their conversation ended, Taepyeong would have to escort Su Chi-bai out of Baekseong-gung. That was the proper etiquette of the place, so no matter what happened, Taepyeong had to avoid getting involved with her. Taepyeong confirmed he understood, but Yayan seemed to have something else to say. Out of nowhere, she pulled out a small knife. Then, suddenly, she asked Taepyeong to show her his arm. And just like that, she started tearing at his clothes, which, of course, caught him completely off guard. Yayan explained that they needed to make Taepyeong look more disheveled. If his clothes and demeanor were bad enough, someone as refined as Su Chi-bai would surely lose interest in him. This was a chance to leave a terrible and lasting impression. Taepyeong agreed that she had a point, but they couldn't overdo it. Yayan simply told him to trust her. All he had to do was act like he didn't recognize her. For example, he could just stay silent and pretend he knew nothing. Taepyeong questioned if that would even work. It didn't seem very natural. Yayan assured him it would be fine. From what she had observed, Su Chi-bai had completely changed after recovering from her illness. Anyway, Yayan just told Taepyeong to think of himself as a rock, a lifeless, emotionless object, but at that moment, Yayan got a little too carried away and tore Taepyeong's clothes more than intended. Now, instead of looking disheveled, he looked more like a beggar. Yayan then reminded him again he had to be an emotionless object, but that wasn't going to help much now, because at this point, Taepyeong was completely screwed. Meanwhile, in Su Chi-bai's conversation with Elder Meng, she humbly stated that despite her unworthiness, she sought his guidance to perform a Taoist technique that would impress his majesty. Given the circumstances, Elder Meng couldn't refuse. Besides, with Su Chi-bai's natural energy, she would surely be able to deliver a breathtaking Taoist performance, one that would likely leave high-ranking officials in awe, earning thunderous applause. But time was short. Even so, since it was an important request, Elder Meng couldn't turn her down. However, he was concerned that the unstable atmosphere of Baekseong Mountain might interfere with their practice. As the leader of that place, he had to prioritize addressing this issue first. So for now, he had to postpone the lessons for Su Chi-bai. Su Chi-bai accepted this without complaint. Elder Meng thanked her for her understanding. Since it was already late afternoon, she should return to her quarters. Oh, and she didn't need to worry, the palace guards would escort her out. At that moment, Elder Meng called for Taepyeong. But then, he quickly noticed that Su Chi-bai seemed unusually excited. He wondered if his speech had been boring. The next second, Taepyeong entered the room, asking if the elder had called for him. Elder Meng declared that their guest was leaving, so he should escort her safely. As they walked, Taepyeong felt Su Chi-bai's gaze on him. Not just her eyes, it felt as though her fists were aimed directly at him. Basically, she wanted Taepyeong to look at her. However, if he did, he would probably die, right? So he held back. When they reached the gate of Baekseong-gung, Taepyeong said goodbye to her. This made her wonder if, perhaps, Taepyeong didn't recognize her. Or maybe the person she saw that day was just a fleeting dream. But then, looking at Taepyeong's arm, she noticed he was wearing the ribbon she had sent with the letter. That quickly made her really happy. It showed that Taepyeong wasn't ignoring her because he didn't remember. He simply couldn't recognize her, even when standing next to her. Which was really sad, because they were so close, yet so far apart. Seeing this sad situation, she didn't know what to do. Because if things continued this way, Taepyeong would end up doing the opposite of what he actually wanted. Now, next to Taepyeong, he declared that he had done everything perfectly. Obviously, he felt a little bad about it, but there was nothing to be done. Then Yun-hee asked if Taepyeong had done everything right. He said yes. She was so irritated that she completely avoided him, which meant it was a win. Yun-hee thought for a while but realized it wouldn't change much. Anyway, he had succeeded. And noticing that she seemed restless, Taepyeong asked why. Yun-hee commented that she wasn't sure. It felt like a strange sensation, like she had made a mistake. Taepyeong said he didn't understand, since they had handled everything perfectly. Either way, they should focus on preparing for the birthday party. Besides, since the party was close, that meant their next plan was almost underway. Recapping, when the mountain demons showed up, Taepyeong would act like a fool in defense and let the noble concept consort spread rumors about him. Things would get worse if he stole jewels, especially from the palace servants, because that would be truly pathetic. Anyway, everything was going according to plan. However, at that moment, Elder Meng called for Taepyeong. Taepyeong introduced himself and wondered why this situation felt so familiar. The elder then stated that he had forgotten to mention to Taepyeong that when accompanying the procession for the party, he should make sure to bring his heavy cold iron sword, as he would be Haeun's dance partner during the sword performance. Taepyeong then realized that nothing was going according to plan. Now, on the day of the festival, the emperor seemed quite happy. Unlike the prince, right? But Taepyeong had already been expecting that. In reality, it was hard to believe that a 14-year-old child could have such a vacant and dark look. This was because the crown prince of Cheongdong-dong, He Wang, couldn't see colors. Since he was young, he had been so absorbed in studying the scriptures that he stopped seeing any color other than black and white ink on paper. So, even when he saw a beautiful scene, he felt no admiration and lived without purpose, like a puppet. The prince's life was glamorous, but far from happy. And according to the romance story Taepyeong had seen, it was Sola who brought that color back. In fact, there was even a scene where Taepyeong's sister, leaving the palace hiding place, took He Wang to the rooftops and showed him the complete view of Cheongdong-dong. There, for the first time, He Wang realized that Cheongdong was truly a beautiful place. The same thing happened during the festival when, after a monster attack that led to a landslide, and after waiting 3 days to be rescued, Sola somehow managed to keep him alive. Of course, back then, she didn't reveal her name, so her identity was unknown. However, because of his photographic memory, he was able to perfectly remember Sola, adding an intriguing point to the beginning of the Celestial Dragon song. Taepyeong noticed that, looking at this part of the story, it seemed familiar to something happening to him now. But no, right? There's no way something like that would happen to him. At that moment, Hudang approached Taepyeong, stating that the sword performance would begin soon. She continued by informing him that they would be using real swords, and the one who cut their opponent's collar first would be the winner. Taepyeong remarked that, given this, the noble consort was at a disadvantage since she was wearing a very elaborate dress. Hudang declared that it didn't matter much. Taepyeong agreed, since the only thing he needed to do was face the noble consort and perform the sword dance. After about 20 moves, Taepyeong would just let her win. But it was still kind of disturbing for him, since he remembered saying he would never use a real sword against someone again. This all happened because when Xiaomeng entered a cave, he witnessed a massacre in front of him. And well, the most surprising part of all this was that a mere child had done all of it. Xiaolan, seeing the elder there, started shouting that he should stay away from them. They had done it because they had no choice or they wouldn't have survived. Before Xiaolan could say anything else, Taepyeong declared that he would never again use a real sword against someone. Elder Meng, approaching Taepyeong, noticed that the bloodstains on his clothes didn't belong to Taepyeong. Those stains on his body could only mean one thing, the divine fever. Therefore, there were only two paths Taepyeong could follow. One, he would become a master of the sword. Or two, a demonic assassin. Even though Taepyeong had stated several times that he didn't want to use a sword, Elder Meng kept pestering him to use it. This confused Taepyeong because most of his strange instructions actually made sense, but this one didn't, which gave him a bad feeling. At this moment, Hildang asked if Taepyeong understood or if he had any doubts. Watching her more carefully, Taepyeong realized that the main servant he knew from the story wasn't the person in front of him. The maid in Celestial Dragon song had a calm demeanor and a completely different name. So, who the hell was this person in front of him? With that, Taepyeong asked the maid when she started working at the Jujak Palace. Hildang replied that she had started as a servant of the mystics at age 9, and since then, 20 years had passed, and she had been working there. She asked Taepyeong why he was asking. He replied that it was nothing, but internally, he knew that Jujak Palace didn't hire just anyone, so there might have been some misunderstanding. Anyway, it wasn't really his concern. But returning to the main topic, Taepyeong asked if she knew why the noble consort had put him on stage. Hildang replied that she didn't know her intentions. Maybe it was to dispel her permanent doubts. Taepyeong asked, what did she mean by that? And she questioned if Taepyeong wasn't from the Huaiguang Soul family. Upon hearing this, Taepyeong realized that people from Jujak Palace were very direct. Hildang continued by saying that everyone knew the noble consort embraced all things with wisdom, but when it came to the Huaiguang Soul family, she couldn't accept them into her heart. So, perhaps by defeating someone from that family like Taepyeong through a formal duel, she hoped to rid herself of all her lingering doubts. However, it was a bit strange, right? Because this duel was purely ceremonial and the noble consort probably knew that. So, what was the point of winning a duel that was more like a game? Hildang confirmed this, but Taepyeong simply told her to relax, as this was his area of expertise. He would ensure he lost in a way that would truly surprise everyone. For Taepyeong, a noble consort was just like one of those annoying bosses. The dynamic he should approach was the same, a blatant display of balance that makes the person look mediocre. And this kind of attitude really got on the nerves of the nobility. Up until now, that was Taepyeong's only goal. He was going to show her how to truly lose. And well, the show had finally started, right? At least the music began to play, and the people were very excited. Taepyeong was in his cold, calculating stance. This was because it was time for the consort consorts from the 4 palaces to show their talents. The first one to perform was a girl with silver hair. According to the comments, she was the one who owned the Biko Palace. And, well, since she had silver hair and skin as white as snow, it was obvious she would be beautiful, right? She was being praised for that. With the music playing, the audience went wild. After a while, she finished her performance, and the audience started saying that she was truly amazing, the treasure of Biko Palace. They probably thought Tsukibi would have a hard time competing with her. To keep her from feeling too bad, right? They could give her a round of applause and maybe even a hairpin to try again next year. Tsukibi began by thanking everyone for being there to see her lack of talents. She said she didn't know how to convey her feelings to them. So, even if it was just a fleeting dream, she hoped it would bring some light to that joyful day. And with that, Tsukibi made a tree that had no leaves bloom, which, obviously, took everyone by surprise. Tsukibi then said that in the benevolent kingdom of Her Majesty, if it was the kingdom of Shongdu, she believed that one day this place would become a country of spring. She wanted to show them a fragment of that vision. The audience was confused, and after a while, the trees were dry again. Even Taepyeong was shocked by that. Honestly, it made no sense how she covered an entire mountain with enchantment magic. At this point, Hildang approached Taepyeong and asked if he was ready. He confirmed that he was. As he grabbed his sword, Taepyeong thought he didn't need to worry about Hyeon. After all, as a noblewoman from a family, and also the most authoritative crown princess among the concubines, she must have some kind of skill, right? Hyeon began by declaring that she was honored to have the opportunity to show her sword dance on such a joyful occasion. Internally, Taepyeong realized that it didn't seem like this was her first time participating in such an event. Meanwhile, they were just talking a lot about majesty, blah blah blah. Taepyeong was still reflecting on how they grew up in completely different environments, but as they were about to begin the sword dance, Taepyeong noticed that Hyeon was trembling. And that didn't match the calm and graceful expression she showed, but her fingertips were shaking. This was all because of the Jujak Palace, where she was surrounded by numerous maidservants. Standing in a magnificent palace dress, in her fiery eyes, there was a youthful spirit that could be called heroic. And all the maidservants from the Shongdu Palace looked at her with admiration. And she was only 19 years old. This showed that even the most favored consort, In Hyeon, the flower of the crown princess, was afraid of others' expectations. She was feeling overwhelmed by the need to prove herself and was afraid of failing. Then she understood why she symbolized bravery in the story. Because courage doesn't mean the urgency of fear. It means that, even when you're scared, simply acting demonstrates that you have courage. And this was something Taepyeong should know better than anyone. That's why he felt so embarrassed, ashamed of disrespecting that noble spirit in front of him. He survived by treating resentment as a tool. He threw away his respect for those who live each moment sincerely. Meanwhile, Hyeon noticed that Taepyeong wasn't moving and asked him to start. Pulling out his sword, Taepyeong began. With the first strike, Hyeon was already shocked, questioning who Taepyeong was. But the dance had to continue. After seeing Taepyeong's few movements, Hyeon realized that he was very skilled with his sword. The people from the Red Arch, noticing Taepyeong's movements, wondered if this was his first time handling a sword. Meanwhile, Janjiai was just observing. Now, over by Seulon, she started to feel cold sweats. The girls asked if she was okay. Of course, she said it was nothing, but inside, she felt restless. She was wondering if, by any chance, Taepyeong was doing something reckless again. But no, he had to get rid of that thing with Miss Sickby. She hoped Taepyeong wouldn't fall into those delusions again. Talking about the spirit of a man, something like that. Although, I guess it's like a mother's spirit, right? Because Taepyeong was literally doing that now. Well, now, to understand a bit of Hyeon's backstory, we need to go back to her past, where someone was telling her to live looking up, because, when she looked down, there would be times when the heights she had reached would make her hands shake in fear. Hyeon asked the man if that was, by any chance, a story about climbing a mountain. Since she had also climbed Beksaki Mountain, the man just praised her, telling her to remember that. Because when the path she climbs is high and fear arises, she should look to herself. So, it would definitely be visible. Of course, there are many in the world who are higher than her, but they do it with pride, without trembling. And when she saw those people, the tremor would naturally disappear. And then she realized why she had lived that way, and that's why he hoped she would remember that. But while that man was speaking to her and gently patting her shoulder, the following year, Seol Ilmun, the head of the Wajayam Seol clan, started a rebellion. 9 high-ranking civil officials above the ministerial level and 11 high-ranking military officials above the general rank died. And like on every funeral day, it was raining that day, and it was that day that a big hole was formed in the young Hyeon's heart. Now, back to the present. Hyeon was reflecting that the power Taepyeong was using definitely wasn't that of an apprentice warrior. However, she couldn't think too much, so she decided to focus. Still, she noticed that Taepyeong's level was quite high, and she remembered the words of that man, that there were many in the world who were higher than her, but they did what they did with pride and without trembling. And when she saw those people, her trembling naturally stopped. And it really worked because she wasn't shaking anymore. But internally, Hyeon was declaring that she had gone crazy. It was impossible. She had defeated many warriors in combat over time. However, most of her opponents had held back against her. She knew they avoided hurting her, as doing so would be a serious offense. But those were the consequences of being in such a high position, so the least she could do was accept it. It was like Taepyeong was also building himself up. However, he had something different. It was as if he was telling Hyun to try again, and if that was the case, she would give her answer. And she really managed to cut a piece of cloth from Taepyeong's shoulder, which of course surprised her. But Taepyeong didn't give her time to think. He quickly counterattacked. Once again, she had to refocus. Changing the stance of her sword, she attacked Taepyeong again, but he defended himself. But apparently she had been wounded, or rather, Taepyeong's strength was greater than hers. Of course, he would seize that opportunity, and Hyun quickly realized she couldn't dodge, so the only thing she could do was block. But at that moment, the sword broke. But of course, it wasn't hers. And watching this fight, the crowd didn't know what to say, so Taepyeong simply shrugged, declaring that such a performance was expected from a noble consort. And of course, Hyun didn't understand a thing. But the audience started celebrating, saying that the noble consort was truly amazing, blah blah blah. However, Hyun knew that wasn't true, since Taepyeong had deliberately let go of his sword, and it wasn't as if he was mocking her or anything like that, but it was a bit annoying for her. She had expected a little more from Taepyeong, and at that moment, the emperor told Hyun to step forward. He would grant her a golden hairpin. The audience started saying that her skill deserved it, but going against this entire tide, Hyun declared that she wasn't worthy of receiving that golden hairpin, and furthermore, her competition had never been fair from the start. So, throwing a sword to Taepyeong, Hyun asked him to unsheath it, and he couldn't refuse, as this was an order. Taepyeong knew that if he ignored those words or went against them, it would be like Taepyeong dragging him. Now, on Hyun's side, she was saying that the golden hairpin was very nice. However, if she had one more match, this time a more serious one, against Taepyeong, that would be enough for her. But interrupting her thoughts, she began trembling in fear as she sensed a strong killing intent, and it was emanating from Taepyeong. It was as if her whole body could respond to this sensation, and the only word running through her mind was death. And if Taepyeong unsheathed that sword, she would probably die. But at that moment, fate played a trick. Suddenly, a servant appeared, shouting that they needed to run because demons had appeared. Or rather, an entire group of demons had appeared. And at that moment, they looked at the mountains, and there was a strange mist, which they named the Mist of Demons. The crowd went wild, and the demons began to emerge. It didn't make sense. How could there be so many demons in the sacred grounds of the royal palace? In any case, they needed to protect the emperor and the crown princess, and they couldn't let any demon get near the Taiwa pavilion. Meanwhile, Taepyeong was extremely shocked. He hadn't noticed this until now, as the perspective of the song of the celestial dragon takes place in the distant past, so it was hard to imagine exactly. But the number of demons there was almost like the Night of the 100 Demons. For those who don't know, it's a very old story from China, Korea, or somewhere like that. There are other works that depict this idea, but basically, it's a lot of demons. Because, well, it's 100 demons, so it makes sense. However, Taepyeong wanted to know why there were so many demons in a place where the authority of Seong Hee-yong was felt the most. But hearing the people's shouts, Taepyeong remembered that his priority was to save lives. However, Taepyeong couldn't help much, because if he was reckless and covered himself in demon blood, Taepyeong's mind would become clouded, and he would end up doing something like the massacre in the cave. The best weapon he had at the moment was that heavy cold iron sword, the same sword he had shown earlier, since it had been specifically made for killing demons. However, looking more closely at the mountain, Taepyeong noticed it could be the appearance of a mid-level demon, and just by showing its head, an earthquake began. And with that part of the pavilion was swallowed by the earth. Sometime later, Hee-yong heard someone calling her name, and it was none other than Hyo-dong. Hyo-dong began explaining that she had been caught in the landslide. It was fortunate that her injuries were not life-threatening, but she needed to get out of Baeksak Mountain. However, Hyo-dong was concerned about her majesty and the crown prince. Nevertheless, Hyo-dong declared that the first thing she should do was take care of Hyo-dong. While Hyo-dong was leaning on her, a demon tried to attack them, but Hyo-dong was faster and managed to kill it. But its blood splattered on Hyo-dong, and she was starting to lose consciousness little by little because of the blood, but she had to make sure it didn't touch Hyo-dong. In the meantime, she found a cave where she could place Hyo-dong inside. After putting her there, she told Hyo-dong to stay safe, and as long as she didn't make any loud noises, she would be safe. Oh, and she shouldn't worry, because her majesty and the crown prince had been taken out before the landslide, and soon, the palace soldiers would sweep through every corner of Baeksak Mountain, so all she needed to do was wait for rescue. Upon hearing this, Hyun asked where Hyo-dong was going. Hyo-dong simply declared that at this moment, she would run and shout to that mist outside, so the monsters wouldn't come to this side. However, it was clear that Hyun didn't want her to do that, but internally, Hyun wanted to know why Hyo-dong seemed so prepared to die. Then, Hyo-dong declared that as a noble lady from the Jikseon family and owner of the Jijak Palace, she should not hesitate to abandon people who wish to survive. After all, Hyun was someone who should move forward, but Hyun didn't want to accept this, because what was the point of surviving if she couldn't protect one of her own? But still, Hyo-dong wished Hyun to stay safe, and even though Hyun shouted over and over, Hyo-dong still left, drawing the attention of all the demons around. The mist began to circle her, and she was killing the demons one by one. But in the meantime, she was also losing consciousness, but she couldn't stop, and the only thought running through her head was that she needed to kill one more. And so, time passed, and she grew more and more exhausted. She collapsed to the ground. At that moment, a demon tried to attack her from behind. She reacted quickly, but her sword didn't wound it. Well, it did wound it, but not fatally. With that, Hyun had accepted her fate. But just at that moment, Taepyeong finished off the demon for her. This quickly surprised her, and she noticed that the demon's blood didn't spurt out, or rather it was frozen. She started to remember that she had heard of this before, one of the 3 precious swords, imbued with the skills of the swordsman Baekseon, the heavy cold iron sword. And as the name suggests, it's incredibly heavy. Only 2 people in the Cheongdu Palace could lift it, the famous General Jong Seoltik and the warrior apprentice Seol Taepyeong from the Baekseon Palace. Suddenly, Taepyeong started shouting that it was very cold. Turning to Hyangdo, he asked if anything was hurting. She told him that he should worry about himself. Taepyeong responded that she didn't need to worry. After all, he was Seol Taepyeong. Yeah, he may be awesome, but his body wasn't. Taepyeong was practically dragging himself. Seeing this, Hyangdo wondered if it wasn't she who should be saved here, because now it was Taepyeong who needed saving. Meanwhile, in another cave, the prince had just woken up and was wondering if he was trapped among the rocks. He noticed a girl in front of him and then realized that she must have taken care of him since he was covered in bandages. The girl, who we already know is Salah, told him to be careful since he was badly injured. He needed to wait for help, but internally, the prince was already in a dark place. He was questioning if his life had any meaning and whether it was worth continuing. Speaking of near death, Taepyeong managed to get up in the middle of the chaos. The first thing he did was take down a demon, or yokai, not sure how to classify it, but he was almost about to pass out again from blood loss. However, at that moment, he remembered Hildang and asked where she was. She was shaking, fighting off demons to protect Taepyeong. Looking around, Taepyeong noticed many corpses, meaning she had defeated numerous demons while he was unconscious. At that point, Hildang told Taepyeong to listen to her because Miss Rayon was in the direction she had come from. She was specifically inside a cave. If Taepyeong followed her tracks, he would certainly find her. He needed to hurry because she wasn't sure if Miss Rayon was okay or if a demon had attacked her. Taepyeong could leave her behind since she would distract the demons. This surprised Taepyeong and made the previous thought click. He had already met this girl in the story. In the original tale, she was supposed to die here. In the original story of the Song of the Celestial Dragon, the chief servant of the Jajak Palace wasn't this girl, but a lady named Gwagyongwei or something like that, can't quite pronounce it. But essentially, it was Hyun, just with a completely different name. Because of her immense courage, she would occasionally give that determined look. But deep inside, in her heart, there was something frozen, a coldness she could no longer feel. Perhaps it was because she had lived her life losing everything she loved. However, it was obvious that Taepyeong wouldn't let her die, right? Now, with Hyun, she realized the cave was safe, but she couldn't stay there. Still, she couldn't do much because she was utterly exhausted. But when she looked at the entrance of the cave, she saw 2 silhouettes. She immediately began to wonder if the demons had smelled her. But no, it was just Taepyeong carrying Hildang in his arms. Hyun was completely confused. Why was Taepyeong here with Hildang? While Hyun was worried about Hildang, Taepyeong was placing a giant stone to block the cave entrance. After doing this, he commented that if Hildang stayed in her current state, she would probably die. Hyun then said that they should take her to a healer. However, since she was too weak, she would need Taepyeong's help. While Taepyeong carried Hildang, Hyun would use her body to clear the path. Taepyeong asked her to calm down, because if she died there and he could have stopped her but didn't, he'd probably end up dying later on. Hyun replied that she couldn't do that. She didn't want to lose anyone else close to her. If Taepyeong helped, she would give him anything he wanted. She only asked for his help. Taepyeong, frustrated because she wasn't listening, shouted loudly. He asked her once again to calm down. At this, Hyun apologized, realizing that Taepyeong's injuries were quite severe too, yet he was still insisting on helping. Taepyeong replied that it was fine, since anyone in that situation would have done the same. Hearing this, Hyun became a bit confused, questioning how he could remain so calm in a situation like this. At this point, she thought Taepyeong was going to give a huge moral lesson, saying some beautiful words, and so on. But no, he simply said that he wasn't calm. He was in so much pain that he couldn't express it. And to make things worse, Taepyeong spoke informally, which completely confused Haeun's mind. After all, she's the princess of that kingdom. And, well, after a little while, Taepyeong managed to help Hyedang, at least relieving a major part of her wounds. But still, he informed her that they needed to get her to a healer as soon as possible. Of course, Haeun was still very worried. Taepyeong continued, saying that with the number of demons around, it was likely Elder Meng was already helping, so it wouldn't take long for the demons to disappear. Taking advantage of this opportunity, they had to head to the Taihioa pavilion. Haeun asked how long Taepyeong thought this would last. He started calculating in his head. The crown prince had been in a near-death state and managed to stay alive, or had been kept alive, for almost 3 days. So, considering the original story, the maximum they could be trapped there was 3 days. That's why Taepyeong told Haeun that 3 days was the limit. The problem was that Hyedang wouldn't survive for 3 days if this continued. So, Taepyeong said that once the demon fog started to clear, they could take the chance to escape. To speed things up, he also planned to defeat a few demons. Haeun mentioned that she wanted to do the same, but she was still too weak. Taepyeong realized that she was in a bit of a complicated situation, or that she couldn't help it, because in a scenario where her life was at risk, the only person she could trust was a descendant of her enemy. It made sense for her to feel uneasy. That's why Taepyeong told her she didn't need to overthink it and should just focus on one goal. Haeyeon asked what that goal was, and Taepyeong responded that she just needed to survive. At this, for some reason, Haeyeon started laughing at Taepyeong, but she agreed that he was absolutely right. However, it wasn't just her who should survive, they both should survive. Taepyeong then said that probably by the time the morning sun rose, they'd have a chance. By now, Elder Meng had probably been handling the whole situation. But even so, the demons wouldn't disappear completely, and the problem was that the night wouldn't be a good time for their sight either. So basically, they had to leave by morning. That's why they needed to rest tonight and conserve their strength. But Haeyeon wasn't very keen on that, considering she was anxious knowing there were demons outside wanting to kill her. Taepyeong just told her to force herself to sleep because otherwise they were in trouble. And besides, she didn't need to worry about the demons, since he had cast a spell to hide his scent from them. He could do this spell, so to speak, because it was basic training in Baeksean. Still, Haeyeon didn't feel like sleeping, so she asked Taepyeong to tell her a bit of his story. Taepyeong began by saying she probably wouldn't like it. Haeyeon remembered that Taepyeong was from the Wagyeongsean family, but she still asked him if there was any reason he felt so uncomfortable about it. Taepyeong replied that yes, since he was an illegitimate son of the Wagyeongsean family. Haeyeon then commented that it seemed like Taepyeong was embarrassed by what his family had done. Taepyeong confirmed it, and that made Haeyeon even more confused because he admitted it so quickly. She then asked how Taepyeong survived the fall of his family. He started saying that he traveled to the capital as a beggar. But of course, he wasn't alone, his older sister was with him. From there, we already know the rest of the story. During this time, Haeyeon listened to Taepyeong attentively. It's not like she could do much else at that moment. At some parts of the story, she started laughing at Taepyeong. At others, she felt sorry for him. Listening to Taepyeong's story, she realized how completely opposite their lives were. While she had lived as a noble from the Wagyeongsean family, Taepyeong's life, with all its struggles, seemed to have a noble meaning in itself. It wasn't like he had received any great purpose or accomplished any notable feats. He simply lived his life with all his strength. At that moment, she even started wondering if it wasn't because of this situation that she was hearing his story for no reason at all. She then told Taepyeong that he was quite skilled with the sword, but didn't seem to have any ambitions. Taepyeong replied that it was because he was from the Wagyeongsean family, but that was more of an excuse, and he felt a bit embarrassed to say it to Her Highness. But his motto was, "You work less, earn more." Wagyeong commented that it was indeed hard to understand Taepyeong, but after everything he had said, somehow, in her eyes, Taepyeong seemed a little more trustworthy. Well, I think it wasn't just trust, since she started blushing. But no, she's a princess, she had to be careful, right? So she continued saying that, compared to the palace, Baeksean was still a less important position. However, it had much better pay than other positions. Taepyeong replied that there wasn't much he could do about that, and besides, Elder Meng hadn't been around for long. So as long as he stayed at the Baeksean palace, he'd stay there even with a low salary. At that, Wagyeong asked Taepyeong if Elder Meng was like a father figure to him. Taepyeong answered no, not at all. And hearing this, Wagyeong really didn't understand Taepyeong, because sometimes he seemed so emotional and suddenly, when it was supposed to be emotional, he wasn't. But even so, it made her laugh. She started thinking that she had never thought talking to someone could be so much fun, and this conversation seemed to revitalize her a bit. So she continued asking Taepyeong more questions, wondering what he would do next. After all, he was the illegitimate son of the Wagyeongseol family, meaning his life wasn't exactly easy. Taepyeong said the next thing he was going to do was make some rice soup. Wagyeong asked, "You okay, what's next?" Taepyeong replied that it was to look at the sky from a poorly built house, feeling the fresh air passing through it along with some cold water next to a surma. He said this because the first time he had that feeling, it was one of accomplishment, since every day he practiced his sword with all his effort. The beautiful narcissus flowers he saw walking along the roadside and the beautiful stars in the sky were things he would never forget, and that's why it was something he wanted to happen again. Of course, for others, it might seem silly, but for him, these little things, when accumulated, created a reason to keep fighting. But putting himself aside, he wanted to know more about Wagyeong. At this point, she began to reflect that there were always people around her talking about their reasons to live. The Ogsean family had always been surrounded by these people, and she herself knew the importance of having a reason to live. Like the prince, for example, he had empty, hollow eyes. When she saw him for the first time, she instinctively realized it. When Crown Prince Hyeol-won sat next to the emperor, Wagyeong noticed that she was afraid of those eyes, and the possibility of having eyes like that was something she had always feared. That's why she had desperately searched for a reason to live, believing that if she kept looking, she would one day find it. Since she was a child, walking through roads and rains, she always kept going, searching for the true reason to live. In response, she told Taepyeong that, surprisingly, they shared similar thoughts. As she continued her life, she realized that there were things buried deep in her mind. Hyodang's loyalty, the admiration of the palace servants, the wrinkled hands of an elderly woman, the fragrance of plum flowers flowers in a vase in the inner chambers, a golden-threaded embroidery, the sway of a butterfly seen while walking in the garden, conversations beyond the door, beautiful teacups, the morning air, a bright moon, poetic clouds. From then on, she just lived, and it was only after that she started searching for reasons to live. But now she realized that she had followed the wrong order, and after saying this, she fell asleep. However, some time later, she was awakened by Taepyeong calling her, as it seemed Hildang's condition was worsening, so they had to leave immediately, whether they wanted to or not. As it was almost at the brink, the fog had probably cleared enough to allow for a better view, and Rayan declared this as good, also noting that her body had regained enough energy to wield a sword. Nevertheless, Taepyeong advised her to be careful, as getting drenched in demon blood would put her in danger. She remarked that it wouldn't be easy for him to defend himself, and at that moment, an idea struck her. She grabbed Taepyeong and told him to take off his clothes, leaving him utterly confused. After they left the cave, Taepyeong was without his shirt, which was now on Rayan. Taepyeong commented that even if she wore his shirt on the rest of her body, she wouldn't be fully protected from demon blood. She responded that she knew that, because if such a simple solution could handle demon blood, no one would have ever suffered because of it. However, for some reason, she felt like she could exterminate countless demons, and that they would reach Taiwa Pavilion quickly. With Taepyeong by her side, she felt confident that she would survive. Hearing this, Taepyeong recalled something someone had once said, at least in the original story, though who knows what's really happening there. Either way, they had to figure out a way to leave. Meanwhile, elsewhere, someone remarked that things had definitely gotten lively compared to when he had been sitting still. At that moment, a member of the Red Arch asked what General Xiong was doing there. The general replied that he had been speaking with his subordinates, but grew frustrated and ran off. As this place was familiar to him, he liked coming here. However, he knew that this time, the demons were causing great chaos. The disciple of the Red Arch responded that most of the demons had already been dealt with. After taking a swig of what seemed to be some kind of liquor, General Xiong remarked that it was unbelievable that demons were coming from Baeksak Mountain. This meant that the celestial dragon's power had surely diminished. Moreover, it was something Princess Ahayan had to handle. The Red Arch guy, somewhat flustered, noted that the general belonged to the main palace. So why had he gone to the secondary palace? Hearing this, the general realized he was being treated like an uninvited guest, just like in the main hall. Still, he replied that he had come to inform them about the warrior who had appeared at the assembly hall. In case anyone didn't understand, he was talking about Taepyeong. The general said he had come to share this news. That crazy guy was from the Baexian palace. According to rumors, he had exterminated hundreds of demons in one night. Speaking of the night, Zhang Hai declared they needed to find the crown prince first. They should start at Taiwa Pavilion. But just then, he noticed someone emerging from the bodies. It was none other than Taepyeong, covered in blood, with two bodies slung over his shoulder. Naturally, Zhang Hai was alarmed but instructed for healers to be brought. However, when he looked where Taepyeong had come from, he saw that Taepyeong had massacred everything in his path. The general went on to say that this guy Zhang Hai had mentioned seemed quite skilled. However, since he wasn't wearing the uniform of a hunter, it meant he was neglecting his duties. Zhang Hai mentioned he had spoken with Taepyeong, and he wasn't exactly someone who belonged in the secondary palace. Protecting Baexian Palace seemed to be his calling, so he would probably leave the palace alone when the time was right. The general commented that, in any case, Taepyeong had saved Miss Haiyong. Since he had killed many demons, the rescue of the crown prince was sped up. As a result, the general suggested it would be appropriate to reward Taepyeong. But after making this suggestion, the main palace staff was shocked. The reason? Taepyeong was from the Huaiguiyang Seol family, which was to be expected because the crime of attempting to kill an emperor, even if it passed down through generations, wasn't easily forgotten. Furthermore, Zhang Hai knew that guy Seol Ilmun. Seol Ilmun was the head of the Huaiguiyang Seol family. On a rainy day, his image walking alone through the main gate, sword in hand, was etched into the memories of the senior officials of Cheongdu Palace. Seol, Tai, and Pyong were extraordinary swordsmen, which probably made them recall Seol Ilmun. This also explained why Taepyeong was born into a family of traitors. Anyway, General Zhang Li remarked that Taepyeong had gotten a very strong sword from Tai and Xiong, and a bit of money. Not wanting to leave Taepyeong empty-handed, he granted him the qualification of a regular warrior. So when the opportunity arose, he could help him rise in rank later. At this point, Zhang Hai remembered Taepyeong's motto, work less, earn more. He thought to himself that Taepyeong had definitely chosen the wrong path. Meanwhile, on Taepyeong's side, he received news that his sister was still bedridden. Yonghui mentioned she had heard this from a maid at Cheongyong Palace. To sum it up, she wasn't in life-threatening danger, which relieved Taepyeong greatly. But Yonghui pointed out that Taepyeong didn't seem too concerned, especially since his only blood relative was almost dying, yet he was so calm. Taepyeong simply replied that after over 10 years together, they knew each other very well. Besides, it wasn't like his sister would die so easily. But honestly, he knew from the original story that she wouldn't die. According to the story, she was rescued along with the crown prince. The crown prince Hyewon was near death and his memory of Solon was faint. To the prince, she was just a girl beyond his hazy memories, which likely made him feel even more drawn to her. And when he recalled all the truths, palace, he would feel a sense of destiny and desire her even more. Since Taepyeong knew his sister well, if the prince offered her a reward, she would simply respond with a smile saying, "I didn't do it expecting any reward." That's how you get a man to fall for you, act like you don't want anything. As Taepyeong thought about this, Younghee was fiddling with his things, specifically his heavy sword. Taepyeong warned her that it was heavy, and if she wasn't careful, she might hurt herself. Younghee asked if he really thought she couldn't handle something like that, but the moment Taepyeong mentioned how expensive it was, she remembered the time she broke a very expensive jar in the main palace. It's probably best not to mention that she had already started trembling in fear, placed the sword in the corner, and sat right next to Taepyeong. And out of nowhere, she yelled at Taepyeong that he was unfair because he treated her like a little sister, while he treated his actual sister like a lady. To sum it up, Taepyeong was treating her like a child. And mind you, Younghee was older than Silla. On top of that, she was just a regular servant. Taepyeong was so fed up that he didn't even know what to say. But no, Younghee wanted Taepyeong to address her formally. And it was pretty clear that Taepyeong didn't want to. But nope, Younghee kept bugging him to call her sister Younghee. After insisting for a while, she just gave up, knowing Taepyeong wouldn't do it. Anyway, she was going to go arrange the blankets and asked Taepyeong to call her when it was time for dinner. As she walked away, Taepyeong noticed that Younghee changes the subject really quickly. But after taking just one step past the gate, she suddenly ran back. Which, to be honest, was probably faster than changing the subject, right? And she was sweating like she'd just run a marathon, despite only taking one step outside the gate. She asked Taepyeong why he kept worrying her. Apparently, she'd heard that a certain lady had just arrived at Baekseon Palace, but Taepyeong had no idea who she was talking about. A little while later, we found out. And no, it wasn't Sukbai, it was none other than Haeyeon. She commented on how happy she was that Taepyeong was in good health, which was expected given his strong physique. Poor Taepyeong, he had no clue what was going on. And Younghee was just as confused, asking Taepyeong what was happening. Haeyeon started saying that Taepyeong didn't even seem like the man from Baeksak Mountain, the one who would say anything. Now, he was just bowing his head deeply, and if that made him a bit reserved or overwhelmed, she would just send all the servants away. Taepyeong asked if everything was alright, since he was theoretically supposed to stay by her side. But Haeyeon asked Taepyeong if he really thought she needed an escort. However, since she laughed loudly, which wasn't really her style, she quickly caught herself, noticing that even the servants seemed a little shocked. Realizing this, she apologized. Then she told Ryudang that she would have a conversation with their lifesaver. So she asked the servants to wait outside the main gate of Baekseon Palace. Ryudang just replied that since there was already a servant at Baekseon Palace, she would accept this request. As the servants left, Younghee remarked that Taepyeong always got himself into trouble. Taepyeong just told her to be quiet because he was trying to organize his thoughts, since he wasn't understanding anything. At that moment, Haeyeon declared that she had two reasons for visiting Baekseon Palace without warning. The first was that she wanted to check if Taepyeong had recovered physically. After all, thanks to him she survived. So the least she could do was make an effort and personally thank him. Taepyeong replied that if she had called him to Jujak Palace, he would have gone gladly. After all, her steps were so precious, just to check the health of a mere warrior apprentice. Hearing this, Haeyeon said that Taepyeong spoke sweet words when he wanted to. Anyway, it wasn't all that bad. Even if he didn't realize it, he was really good with words. But back to the main topic. The second reason she was there was to ask Taepyeong to teach her how to wield a sword. Taepyeong didn't quite understand. Haeyeon continued by saying that the swords of the warriors from Cheongdu Palace were filled with fear. However, Taepyeong's sword had a spirit, and since Taepyeong claimed not to have any desire for success, she would make sure to pay him properly. But of course, depending on what Taepyeong asked for, there wasn't much she could do. Taepyeong responded that teaching her how to wield a sword would be a bit difficult. Haeyeon, inspecting Taepyeong and Younghee, commented that she had been feeling something for a little while, like they were hiding something from her. If he had that, he should stop, because how could she reward Taepyeong if he wouldn't even talk about what he needed? At this, Younghee and Taepyeong exchanged a look and somewhat explained the situation. Haeyeon immediately burst into laughter, saying that if everything Taepyeong had said was true, it would really be a disaster. She was laughing because she found it funny, not because she was mocking Taepyeong's situation. Then she sat next to him and apologized, since the situation was kind of serious. But as soon as she sat down, they both quickly bowed in front of her. Haeyeon felt a little out of place due to her status, but returning to the topic of Taepyeong teaching her the sword, she wondered why Taepyeong was so hesitant. Did he think she still held a grudge against him? Or maybe she wasn't discerning enough to learn. Either way, Taepyeong's self-awareness seemed unexpectedly inflated. But setting that aside for now, Sukbai still wasn't of legal age, so her judgment, like others, wasn't perfect. And that was one of the reasons she laughed. She hadn't laughed like that in a long time. And that's when Taepyeong remembered that it was true. Sukbai wasn't of legal age and had an inflated ego. But I think Taepyeong confused the roles here, right? But that's fine. However, Ryan commented that it was kind of hard to do anything with Taepyeong. For that reason, she would keep a close eye on the Seongyong Palace. She then asked Taepyeong once more if he was willing to teach her how to wield a sword. Taepyeong didn't know how to respond, because Ryan's request was so genuine it was blinding him. Taepyeong declared that at that moment, it was Ryan who had saved saved their lives, not him. Ryan noticed that Taepyeong was in a bit of a panic because of her statement, so this time she decided to let it go, but she would definitely send someone else after her. And as soon as Ryan left, Yeonhee and Taepyeong looked at each other. Then, they simply embraced, declaring that they were alive. Because, well, they had spoken with Ryan, and Ryan said she would handle the issues, right? So Taepyeong's problems were finally over. A little while later, when night fell, Ryan noticed that spring was coming. She hoped the weather would warm up soon. Then Hildang appeared and told Miss Ryan that it was a little cold outside, so she should come inside. As Ryan made her way back to her room, she looked at the moon and remembered the words Taepyeong had said, that he only felt alive by silently gazing at the beautiful moon. Looking at it now, she thought that this was probably the feeling Taepyeong had back then. However, her memory quickly drifted back to when Taepyeong was shirtless, which made her blush. Hildang asked if she was okay, but Ryan made up an excuse, saying her foot was a little cold and she couldn't feel much. Internally, she wanted to convince herself that everything she had thought earlier was just a mere illusion. The next day, while with Taepyeong, he told Elder Meng that they had run out of rice. The elder remarked that this was not typical of Taepyeong, as he was the one managing the supplies and food in the hall. Taepyeong responded, saying, the truth is, Yeonhee couldn't contain her frustration and ended up cooking. The problem is, she messed everything up and ruined it. The elder was somewhat outraged. How could a maid not know how to cook a simple meal? Taepyeong continued, explaining that since she was handling a kitchen knife so poorly, she was punished. But Yeonhee was upset. What had she done to deserve this? Taepyeong shouted at her, saying she wasted 27 noodles. Yeonhee commented that she would probably have to buy rice outside the palace for a while. Taepyeong told her not to bother, he would go in her place. After all, he had some money left over from a reward he received last time, so he was a bit more comfortable spending it now. However, Elder Meng suggested that Taepyeong take some money from the chest in the inner room. With that, Taepyeong left the Baexian pavilion. Since so many flowers were blooming, it was clear that it was spring. As Taepyeong recalled, this was the 16th spring since Seol Taepyeong, the normal warrior, had welcomed the world. While walking, Yeonhee followed him. Taepyeong kept sighing, which made her feel uncomfortable. It was like she had already apologized for what happened, but if Taepyeong had complaints, at least he could tell her. Taepyeong started thinking to himself that the reason he was sighing so much was because the process to leave Seongdwa Palace was incredibly complicated. The place was so big that it took an hour just to go through the body checks. He still needed to go through an identity check, and on the way back, he would have to carry a bunch of rice sacks. But on the bright side, it had been a while since he last left the palace. Looking around, Taepyeong saw some products and people. He commented that it was pretty calm there since the anniversary celebration. Yeonhee agreed. She even wondered if Lady Haein really used her influence because it seemed very calm there. Taepyeong responded that he didn't want to know because it was so nice to have peace that he would rather live like that until he died. Yeonhee continued, saying she heard from the maids that there was a reason the selection for the next leader was delayed. After this complicated selection process, someone was chosen for the queen position. But guess what? The person chosen simply declared that they didn't want the position. Now they would have to start the selection process from scratch. According to Yeonhee, all the palace staff had that look on their faces. Taepyeong laughed at her, which she didn't like because she was just mimicking the guys, and it wasn't meant to be funny. Anyway, back to the topic, Yeonhee was a bit surprised that there were people like that in the world because she didn't believe anyone would turn down the position of owner of the Hyeonmu Palace. Because, like, even she herself would love to pretend to be the owner and live in such a big palace at least once. Taepyeong commented that the girl probably had her own reasons, and it wasn't that great to envy people in high positions because they were also burdened with problems. Yeonhee agreed, since she was in a position where they ran out of rice and she had to leave the palace. However, Taepyeong replied that they were only doing this because of her. At this moment, Taepyeong began to reflect, having heard that the queen hadn't been chosen yet, which meant that it wouldn't be long before the original story of the Celestial Dragon song began. However, he didn't believe that the queen's position was still vacant. Anyway, he didn't want to get involved with the concubines anymore. Even though Taepyeong had some issues with Sukbai, he didn't want to get involved with the other two. Of course, Taepyeong was keeping an eye on Haeon, but it wasn't a big deal. Either way, things had been peaceful so far, despite all these problems. Now, he could enjoy the clear winds and the bright moon while taking care of the Baexian Palace. For him, that was life. Yeonhee didn't understand anything because Taepyeong always said this out of nowhere. Meanwhile, elsewhere, someone was telling Sukbai that they couldn't teach her. Sukbai commented that she didn't remember learning anything considered good. The guy she was talking to started sweating and told her to seek guidance from someone far more accomplished than him. After all, he wasn't in a position to be the master of Jin Sukbai. His level was too low. Sukbai was confused because he wasn't the most skilled Taoist near Mount Hanha. The guy responded, actually, I'll tell you, tomorrow I'm leaving for Mount Hanha to train. After he left, Sukbai called Hone, asking when the next high-ranking officials meeting would be. Hone replied it would be next month at the main palace. To that, Sukbai commented that she would probably need to get permission directly from the minister. Hone didn't understand anything Sukbai was saying, so Sukbai declared that this way, she should learn Taoism Taoism directly from Baek-sien. They say he's such a respected and busy person that even the high officials can't treat him carelessly. But if Baek-sien doesn't go, and for those who don't remember, Baek-sien is Elder Mang, she should seek his teachings by entering and leaving the Baek-sien palace herself. At this point, she started daydreaming, wondering what kind of hairpin she should wear and that she should be careful with her hair. After a while, she realized she was getting too excited since the meeting hadn't even happened yet, but she was still very embarrassed. Meanwhile, Aweng knew that Sukbai was just trying to find a way to get time with Taepyeong. To outsiders, Sukbai appeared to be a beautiful girl planning an adventure outside the palace. However, if Taepyeong were there, it would feel like a grim reaper holding a scythe, declaring that his death was near. A little later, at a tea party, which was like a gathering of the crown prince's consorts held twice a month, Haeyeon brought up the topic of Sukbai wanting to visit the Baek-sien palace twice a week. Sukbai confirmed, saying that before, she had a Taoist who would go to Shangyong Palace to pass on Taoist teachings to her. But apparently, it would be difficult for her to receive those teachings from that person. That's why she hoped Haeyeon would speak favorably about it in the council meeting. She noticed that Haeyeon had found her Taoism skills quite interesting during the last anniversary celebration. Haeyeon confirmed, saying she had never thought Lady Sukbai was so skilled in Taoism. Sukbai also said she was impressed by Haeyeon's fencing skills. She also mentioned that Lady Deokbai's Shangyong dance was truly enchanting. Deokbai, the girl with silver hair, thanked her for the compliments. She commented that Haeyeon had a hairpin that suited her perfectly. Haeyeon agreed but still thought it was a bit too extravagant. Internally, Haeyeon aimed to build a closer relationship with them to create a happier atmosphere. But she already felt uncomfortable with them from the start. Also, they hadn't even sat down and the atmosphere was already uneasy. But since the battle wasn't over yet, she still had to address that topic. Just as she was about to speak, Sukbai mentioned that she had heard that Haeyeon was receiving sword training directly from a guard at Baek-sien Palace. And she probably had a specific reason for that, right? Because there was no way she would be getting training from a low-ranked warrior. Haeyeon was somewhat shocked by this. However, Sukbai continued, saying that she had received about 2 months of Taoism training from Hanha's Taoist master, but he had quit quickly. Since he wasn't the right teacher for her, she wanted to know Haeyeon's opinion because guidance was an important matter. And since she was getting taught by someone of such a low rank, Haeyeon should find someone more suitable for it, right? But Haeyeon just stated that this warrior was very skilled, which made the training worthwhile. Sukbai then asked if that was really the only reason. Haeyeon responded that when seeking guidance in swordsmanship, there was no need for anything more than skill. Internally, Haeyeon told herself that this was the only reason. There was no secondary motive. Seizing the opportunity, Haeyeon began to tease Sukbai, mentioning that she had heard Sukbai was after the teachings of Elder Mang. However, since he was always so busy, it would probably be difficult for her to get anything from him. And since he didn't have disciples, there wasn't much she could do. Sukbai just responded that this was something she should take care of herself. Of course, she knew Haeyeon was concerned about the situation. That must be because of her kindness, as vast as the ocean. Hearing those words, Haeyeon realized that Sukbai was very clever for her age, knowing exactly when to strike and when to retreat. But it was still a bit confusing. How could someone so intelligent, someone who couldn't control her emotions, potentially cause the downfall of Seol Taepyeong? Even Haeyeon admitted that every time she thought about Taepyeong, she felt a strange sense of fascination. However, she also knew that if this fascination grew the wrong way, it could become a sword capable of decapitating Taepyeong. And as she was dealing with this fascination, it seemed unfair to her because Sukbai could run free. Realizing what she was thinking, Haeyeon began to blush, and Sukbai asked if she was alright. Haeyeon responded that she was fine, but for some reason, Sukbai seemed really upset, as if she could see something that others couldn't. Now, on Taepyeong's side, he was being informed that it had been decided that Sukbai would do Taoism at Baek-sien Palace a few times a week, so he would need to make sure to accompany her there and back. And since this was an order from their superiors, Taepyeong had no choice but to accept. Looking at Sukbai, Taepyeong went into a panic because he was hoping Rayon would help him out. While Taepyeong walked her, Sukbai commented that Baek-sien Palace was very far from the concubines' quarters. It was such a hassle to walk, especially in silence. The thought of having to walk like this every week already tired her out. Basically, she wanted Taepyeong to give her attention. When they were getting close, Sukbai recalled that Taepyeong had visited the Cheongryong Palace when she was bedridden and sick. Taepyeong confirmed it, and Sukbai wished that Taepyeong at least pretended to know her, since he wasn't just some lowly warrior. After all, she wouldn't talk so casually with him like this. But I think she found Taepyeong's loyalty cute. The poor guy had no idea what was going on. How could she be embarrassed about Nada? Then she asked Taepyeong if he had received the gifts, and he confirmed it. She asked about the divine fever Taepyeong had, and Taepyeong gave a brief response, saying he had only been sick for a short time when he was young but had recovered. Then she asked if it was hard being a warrior. He responded that it wasn't, and he was very satisfied. Internally, Taepyeong was telling himself that everything was going well. His answers were as suitable and quick as possible. But while he was walking, Taepyeong heard a noise that immediately startled him. When he looked back, he asked Sukbai if she was okay. In fact, she was crying. Taepyeong asked what was wrong, and she started to reply that it was nothing. She said that from what she remembered of Taepyeong, he had been such a lively man when he had visited Seongyong Palace. But now, when he talked to her, he seemed like such a cold person. Taepyeong didn't even know how to respond. If he responded with more affection, it would backfire. But if he continued this way, it would also backfire. Internally, he was once again complaining to Ha-yeon, because he had been counting on her to solve this situation. Speaking of Ha-yeon, she was reflecting that Sukbai must have already entered Baekseon Palace. She also remembered that she had made a promise to Taepyeong but hadn't been able to do anything. So she came up with a solution. She called Hyodang, telling her to prepare because they were going out, and the destination was none other than Baekseon Palace. Hyodang didn't understand. Since Sukbai was already there, why would they go? But Ha-yeon just told her to prepare. Hyodang reluctantly accepted, but internally, she already knew chaos would follow. Now, we see a character who hasn't appeared in the story for a while. None other than Seolon, saying the weather was very nice. In fact, she had been bedridden since the anniversary celebration. And to make things worse, there was an end-of-year event. She was already getting frustrated with staying in Seonghaeang. Anyway, since Taepyeong had become a regular warrior, she was very happy for him. So today, she was going back to Baekseon Palace. She then made up an excuse to the palace guard, saying the ingredients had been delivered incorrectly to Baekseon Palace. So, she was going to inform the kitchen in the outer palace. The guard simply said she needed to make sure she returned before sunset. While walking, Seolon reflected that there had been a big issue last fall too, where Sukbai had developed feelings for Taepyeong. That had caused quite a stir, right? But later, the maid Huen had sent a letter saying everything had been resolved, stating that Sukbai had quickly regained her composure. That was a relief. As she was thinking about this, she noticed two head maids in front of Baekseon Palace, which immediately worried her. At that moment, Yeonhee approached her, informing her that Ha-yeon's and Sukbai's laws were at the palace right now. Seolon didn't even know how to react. Wasn't everything supposed to have been resolved? She had received a letter saying that the problem with Sukbai had been taken care of. Yeonhee commented that she thought so too, but she should know that saying, right? Use one thorn to remove another. Seolon replied that she did. At that point, Yeonhee added that, actually, Ha-yeon's look toward Taepyeong wasn't good at all. Seolon immediately sensed something was wrong and asked what the hell that meant. Yeonhee shouted that she didn't know either. She wanted Taepyeong to explain it to her as well. In fact, she had trusted Ha-yeon to handle Sukbai. However, when she looked at the expression on Ha-yeon's face when she called Taepyeong at the Baekseon Palace earlier this morning, it was clear she had ulterior motives. Hearing this, Seolon immediately panicked, questioning what the hell her brother was doing. Just then, another person appeared, telling them to stop blocking the path. Looking back, they realized it was none other than Jeonji-hai. Seolon immediately feared he was about to kill Taepyeong, but Jeonji-hai quickly remembered who Seolon was, stating that she was the woman he had seen on the stone path at the back of Baekseon Palace. Seolon confirmed, stuttering, that she hadn't expected him to remember her. Yeonhee quickly apologized to Jeonji-hai, explaining that there were some very distinguished people inside the palace right now. She asked why he was there. Jeonji-hai asked which distinguished people she was talking about. Caught off guard, Yeonhee was at a loss because she couldn't say that Ha-yeon and Sukbai were in the palace. Instead, she simply stated that an important guest was there. Jeonji-hai commented that it must be someone from the upper ranks. He explained that he had come because an imperial decree had been issued from the main palace, ordering every palace to send a soldier. It was for a search operation led by the main palace. Seolon asked if this search was by any chance for Her Majesty. The look in Jeonji-hai's eyes told her she shouldn't have asked that. She quickly apologized. Jeonji-hai, looking at her in a dazed manner, mentioned that more than a week had passed since Hyunbai had fled to the capital. Since she was none other than the owner of Hyamu Palace, they couldn't just stand by. Therefore, the plan was to mobilize a large number of warriors to search toward the capital. From the way he spoke, it seemed like this was confidential or high-ranking information. Ha-yeon began to feel that something was off. She thought the original work of Celestial Dragon Song probably had a lot of romance, because how could this be? But returning to the main point, Seolon asked Jeonji-hai if by any chance he was planning on taking Taepyeong with him. Jeonji-hai asked if she had any connection to Taepyeong. By the tone of his voice, it seemed like he was jealous, and Ha-yeon noticed this. Seolon explained that Taepyeong was her younger brother, who had come with her when she left the Waegunseol clan. Upon hearing this, Jeonji-hai appeared greatly relieved. Ha-yeon noted this as well. She couldn't help but wonder what on earth these two siblings were up to. Why were they so enchanting to both the ladies and the lords of the upper ranks? Seolon was beautiful and had a good personality, so it was understandable that she was popular. As for Taepyeong, well, he just liked soup and noodles and preferred to do things the laziest way possible. Getting back to Jeonji-hai's conversation, he mentioned that since Seolon had confirmed Taepyeong was her family, he had another piece of information for her. General Jeonji-hai was very interested in Taepyeong. That was one of the reasons Jeonji-hai had come, to try to secure a higher position for Taepyeong. Seolon was deeply impressed by this because General Jeonji-hai was very close to the emperor, meaning Taepyeong was about to rise to a high rank. Seeing how excited Seolon was, poor Jeonji-hai started to choke up. At this point, Yeonhee didn't need to speculate anymore. Just then, someone exited Baekseon Palace. Ha-yun. Of course, Jeonji was a bit startled, but he bowed and mentioned he hadn't realized Ha-yun was at Baekseon Palace. Ha-yun casually stated she had come to see if she could spar with Taepyeong for a moment. Jeonji asked if she was planning to take Taepyeong with her. At the mention of a taking or a getting at Taepyeong, Ha-yun immediately blushed, insisting that wasn't it. She said the weather seemed nice, so she wanted to take a walk through the outer palace, and since Taepyeong was nearby, she thought she could spar with him. She then asked what Jeonji was doing there. He shared the same information he had already told Seolan. Not wanting to listen to the whole story, Ha-yun told him to fill her in later and said it was time for her to go. At that moment, Seolan began to cry, as it seemed Yunhee had been right. She turned to Yunhee asking what would become of Taepyeong now. Yunhee reassured her, saying everything would be fine because there was still a way. No matter how deep a person's affection, if their bodies were distant, their hearts would inevitably grow apart. As for the special team Jeonji had mentioned, they needed to make sure Taepyeong didn't refuse them. Now we shift to Sukbai's side. Elder Meng was teaching her that Taoist techniques, once reaching a certain level, ultimately lead to a deeper understanding of oneself. Apparently, Sukbai hadn't fully grasped the extent of her own abilities, so she needed to calm her inner energy and become aware of what she was truly capable of. Once she achieved that clarity, her energy would change. As she listened to Elder Meng, Sukbai realized that his understanding of Taoist techniques was entirely different from that of other masters she had known. Finally, she had found a worthy teacher. After the training ended, Elder Meng mentioned that she had become quite proficient in sensing and managing her energy. He suggested they end for today, and she could return to the royal concubine's quarters. Sukbai thanked him, and he acknowledged her progress. He told her she might even reach enlightenment on her own rather than through his teachings. After returning to Xiongnuang Palace, she should take some time to feel her energy thoroughly. In doing so, she would gain much more insight. As the day's lessons ended, she told Huin it was time to head back. As she reflected on the journey there, Sukbai realized she had made a big mistake with Taepyeong. While shedding tears wasn't necessarily an error, it had been an opportunity. If she offered words of reconciliation and lifted his spirits, he might return to his old self. However, she thought Taepyeong was at the main gate. Unfortunately, Huin informed her that the lady from Jujaki Palace had entered Baekseon Palace and had taken Taepyeong with her. Upon hearing this, Sukbai went into shock, asking what she was saying. When Huin tried to explain, she quickly fell silent and bowed. Reflecting on how this was the first time she had seen Lady Sukibai show an expression like that, now, on Taepyeong's side, he told Ha-yun that, at this rate, his expectations were diminishing with each passing moment. Ha-yun acknowledged that Taepyeong's concerns were completely valid. However, since she had made a promise, she needed to keep an eye on things, right? Besides, they had something important to discuss. So, she asked Hyodang and the other servants to step outside. Once they did, Ha-yun told Taepyeong that, first of all, he shouldn't misunderstand her words and should listen carefully. This was about Taepyeong's life, and she needed a lot of courage to say it to him. Although she had made that promise with him so confidently, she apologized. She was still figuring out how to handle it. But basically, she may have developed feelings for him, similar to love. Hearing this, Taepyeong was shocked. Wait, was that a confession? Ha-yun confirmed it, saying that since she, too, was a woman, it was natural. But still, it was just a passing feeling. Therefore, Taepyeong should consider the courage she had in sharing her feelings for him. Taepyeong asked what he should do in response then. Ha-yun simply told him not to say anything yet since she needed some time to organize her thoughts. Also, he shouldn't get too close. And as for her promise to look after Sukbai, if something unexpected happened, she would step in. Taepyeong kind of thanked her, but now, as for how he would handle things with her, he could act in his own way. Unfortunately for him, he felt like there were two swords pointed at his neck. Ha-yun then mentioned that, for now, there was no need for Taepyeong to teach her fencing. She would call on him once she had her thoughts in order. To which Taepyeong replied that just hearing those words made him feel like he was already dead. Taepyeong also added that Sukbai's Taoist technique lesson was probably over by now, so she should return. Ha-yun agreed. As Taepyeong was being led to Sukbai, he glanced at Ha-yun and noticed she was blushing. But at this point, he had no idea what to do. Just then, his thoughts were interrupted by a voice saying that Taepyeong was indeed in the royal concubine's quarters. It was none other than Sukbai. She was happy to see Taepyeong, of course, but when she saw Hyodang behind him, she quickly deduced that he had been at the Jujak Palace. Taepyeong apologized for not being able to take her back, to which Sukbai replied that it wasn't his fault. After all, if the lady from the Jujak Palace had insisted on him escorting her personally, there wasn't much he could do. However, she didn't know that Lady Ha-yun was so perceptive. Either way, she was happy to have met Taepyeong, even if it was by chance. Taepyeong, confused, didn't understand what she was trying to say. Sukbai then apologized for earlier, saying she had said some insensitive words. She asked if she apologized to Taepyeong, would he forget it? Taepyeong instantly replied that he would pretend nothing happened, but Sukbai told him that he should only forget it on the surface, but that he should remember her words. Taepyeong didn't understand. Was he supposed to forget or not? Sukbai then said that they would talk more in detail the next time she visited the palace. Taepyeong, as I said, was totally lost. One minute she said she liked him, the next she told him to forget it but then remember. It was all so confusing. Later, Seol Seolan asked Taepyeong how things had ended up like this. Poor Taepyeong, so numb by now that he didn't even realize his sister was at Baekseon Palace too. She replied that she had come to congratulate him for becoming an official warrior. But what the heck was going on? Yeonhee also asked Taepyeong what he was doing at Jujak Palace. Taepyeong replied that he had been talking to Haeyeon. Yeonhee then asked why. Suddenly, an awkward silence hung in the air. Yeonhee declared, "My god, what did you do?" Taepyeong, already in trouble, heard Seolan say that she had a solution. Yeonhee confirmed with Seolan, declaring that they had found a way for Taepyeong to survive.